A Russian-born woman has been sentenced to 21 years in a U.S. prison for trying to kill her American look-alike with poisoned cheesecake and then stealing her identity. Viktoria Nasyrova, 47, was found guilty of attempted murder by a New York jury in February 2023. On August 28, 2016, Nasyrova contacted a Queens-based beautician she'd seen a few times. A Ukrainian immigrant named Olga T. Vike pictured. Nasyrova said she was going on vacation to Mexico the next day and needed an emergency eyelash repair. The only problem was that Olga was not at work. It was her day off. Viktoria pleaded with Olga to allow her come to her house for an appointment. Olga accepted Nasyrova's plea, and when Nasyrova arrived, with her were 3 square pieces of cheesecake. Nasyrova insisted Olga try it, and she obliged. 20 minutes later, Olga says she began to feel sick and eventually passed out. Olga's neighbor would later tell police he saw a woman come by the house the next morning with some chicken soup. After the woman quickly went up to Olga's room, the neighbor said the woman headed downstairs, cleaned the bowl, and left. After not seeing or hearing from Olga all day, the neighbor said he went up to Olga's room to check on her. He said he found Olga passed out in bed wearing lingerie. There were pills scattered on the floor and, despite the fact that it was summertime, the heater in Olga's room was set to high. He said he called an ambulance. Records show Olga checked into New York Presbyterian Hospital in Queens, New York, where she would stay for 3 days. The hospital performed a urine analysis and a complete blood count test, but both came back negative for any illicit substances. Olga was discharged on September 1st. After being alerted that Olga was ill, her sister, Irina, flew to New York from Ukraine. She contacted police. NYPD Detective Kevin Rogers received a phone call from patrol officers stating that there was a woman in a semi-conscious state who reported that valuables, including handbags, had been stolen from her room. Detective Rogers went to the scene and interviewed Olga. She told Rogers the last thing she remembered was her client, Viktoria Nasyrova, coming over with a piece of cheesecake that made her incredibly ill. She said she lost consciousness, and her next memory was after returning home from the hospital. Rogers was suspicious and wondered why someone would target Olga. He recovered the cheesecake container with remaining pastry crumbs still inside and instructed his team to bag it for evidence and testing. Rogers tried to find Nasyrova, but couldn't. After Olga Tesvike returned to work, another client told her she knew of someone who had a very similar experience. A few months earlier, a business owner in Queens named Ruben Borokov found a match on a Russian dating site who said she loved to cook. Her name? Viktoria Nasyrova. After the two arranged to meet for dinner, Nasyrova served Borokov a piece of fish. As soon as he tried a bite, he said he passed out. He said Nasyrova took cash, credit cards, and went on a shopping spree while he was unconscious. 2 days later, Borokov was still out of it. He said Nasyrova took him to his dry cleaning business, where his employees urged his sister to call an ambulance. Nasyrova fled, but not before taking cash out of a drawer. Authorities say nobody investigating Nasyrova for the New York poisonings knew she was already a wanted woman. In 2014, Alla Alexienko, pictured right, mysteriously disappeared in Russia, where Nasyrova was then living. Alexienko's daughter, Nadia Ford, who was living in New York, had looked into her mother's disappearance. Suspecting Nasyrova was involved and that Nasyrova had left Russia to settle in New York, Interpol issued an international alert for Nasyrova, also known as a red notice, but authorities were unable to find her. In early 2017, Ford hired a private investigator named Herman Weisberg to find Nasyrova. By scouring her Facebook profile, he found out she lived in Sheepshead Bay, a Russian neighborhood in Brooklyn, remarkably only 5 or 6 blocks away from Ford herself. After a month of investigating, Ford's hired sleuth was able to pinpoint Nasyrova's exact location, thanks to some amazing detective work. After observing the photos Nasyrova had posted on Facebook, Weisberg noticed Nasyrova was wearing mirrored sunglasses in some of her selfies. From the reflections in her glasses, and from other photos, he was able to find both the car she drove and the apartment building where she was living. On the morning of March 20th, 2017, Weisberg alerted local police to Nasyrova's whereabouts. She was arrested and taken into custody the same day. After obtaining a search warrant for the apartment where Nasyrova was living, police recovered multiple handbags, a ring, and multiple pieces of identification belonging to Olga TV. Rogers, alerted of Nasyrova's arrest, began reviewing evidence photos of items found in her apartment. After seeing the photos of Olga's ID, Rogers recognized there was a striking resemblance between Olga and Nasyrova. He says it dawned on him that Nasyrova was after more than material goods. She wanted Olga's identity. Rogers soon ordered the cheesecake container from Olga's home to be tested at 2 forensic labs. One of the tests came back positive for a drug called phenazepam, a potentially lethal sedative primarily found in Russia. Rogers learned that the drug's effects were heightened in a hot environment. Remember, when Olga was found in her room, the heat was set on high, even though it was a hot August day. The tests also revealed Nasyrova's DNA was on the container. The forensics tests convinced Rogers all the more that the attack on Olga had been a premeditated murder attempt. On February 15, 2018, Viktoria Nasyrova was already in custody when she was charged with attempted murder. At the arraignment, she pleaded not guilty. After Nasyrova spent nearly 6 years in custody, due in part to pandemic-related delays, opening statements were finally heard in the case against her on January 30, 2023. On the third day of trial, Nadia Ford took the stand. The judge limited prosecutors from going into specifics about the murder charges facing Nasyrova in Russia. However, Ford was still able to convey important details about her mother's disappearance to the jury. After an hour and a half of deliberation, the jury found Nasyrova guilty of attempted murder. Olga Tsvaik, pictured center with Nadia Ford to her right, later expressed relief about the verdict in an interview, saying she finally feels she has justice. Nasyrova faced a maximum of 25 years. More than 2 months after the verdict, Judge Kenneth Holder called Nasyrova an extremely dangerous woman. While announcing her sentence, Nasyrova was sentenced to 21 years in jail. With credit for time served, she could be out in 15 years. But authorities say after Nasyrova serves her time in New York, she will face deportation and a potential trial in Russia for the murder of Alla Alexyenko. The husband of a Delaware woman, whose 2019 murder remains unsolved, has been arrested on a slew of assault charges after attacking his current wife and biting off her finger. Benjamin Ledyard, 55, has been charged with second-degree assault, terroristic threatening, and menacing in the New Year's Day assault on Stephanie Ledyard, whom he married in 2021. Delaware State Police say the new Castle County assault case is separate from the homicide of Ledyard's previous wife, Susan Morrissey Ledyard, and has no bearing on our investigation at this time. Susan's body was discovered on July 23, 2019, in the Brandywine River in Wilmington, Delaware. Her murder investigation is still active and ongoing, state police say. Ledyard, who has not been named a suspect in Susan's murder, was arrested on separate assault charges on Sunday and is being held on $77,000 cash bond at the Howard Young Correctional Institution. He is set to appear in court on January 25th. Ledyard was taken into custody on Sunday after New Castle County police were called to the couple's home on Camp David Road in the Tallyville neighborhood of Presidential Estate. The couple had gotten into an argument over loud music, and he allegedly chased her around the house, swinging a pool cue at her, according to the police report. Stephanie Nixon Ledyard, 54, who had fled the house to call for help, was suffering from injuries allegedly caused by her husband. According to the arrest warrant, Stephanie told police that Ledyard had been drinking while playing pool when she asked him to turn down the loud music. The couple began arguing, and Ledyard told his wife, "Tonight, I'm going to definitely give you a good beating," before he picked up a cue stick and started swinging it at her. Stephanie told police that he chased her around the house with the cue stick and hit her with what she believed was a white square marble block with a black figurine on it, the warrant said. Ledyard then pushed Stephanie to the ground, grabbed her hair, and repeatedly smashed her head into the hardwood floor, she stated. Officers wrote in the report that Ledyard refused to speak with them. The court documents also revealed that Ledyard was charged in a previous attack on Stephanie last summer, in which he allegedly bit off the tip of her pinky finger. Stephanie told authorities at the Wilmington Hospital emergency room at the time that she injured her finger in a doorframe, and that Ledyard was with her. But she told police this week that Ledyard had bit the tip of her finger off and told her, "I think I swallowed it." Ledyard was charged on New Year's Day with first-degree assault. Ledyard's New Year's Day arrest comes more than 3 years after his previous wife Susan was found dead in the Brandywine River in Wilmington on July 23, 2019. Her car was found parked on Walker's Mill Road, about 3 miles upriver. Susan's death was not determined to be a homicide until months later. In September 2019, Delaware State Police said they did not believe Susan committed suicide, and said they were confident she did not enter the water where her car was found. The state medical examiner's office determined Susan's cause of death to be blunt force trauma and drowning. In November 2019, state police officially declared her death a homicide. Ledyard had previously told police that he went to a movie the night Susan was last seen in July 2019. He said he came home and went to bed while Susan stayed up texting friends on the West Coast. He stated that he was awoken the next morning by Delaware State Police looking for Susan. They told him they found his wife's car. Months after Susan's body was found, Delaware State Police labeled her death a homicide, saying she died from blunt force trauma and drowning. Susan's sister Meg Morrissey Heinecke stated, "We want to remind the public that Susan's case is an active, open homicide investigation," she wrote in an email. "We will continue to do everything in our power to help get this case solved. There is a $50,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. Susan's family and friends love and miss her terribly, and we will continue to fight for answers." Ledyard's family has created the Susan Morrissey Foundation in her honor, which awards a cash scholarship to a student at Academy Park High School, where Susan used to teach before she was killed. Susan was an English teacher in California and Pennsylvania for over 20 years and loved sharing her passion for the written word, according to the foundation's website. In June 2021, the foundation gave out the first $2,500 Susan Morrissey Ledyard Prize for Achievement in English to Nicholas Manus, a student at Academy Park High School. Academy Park High School seniors Rodney Brown and Jenot Palamans were recipients of the 2022 Scholarship Prize. Detectives continue to seek information from the public regarding Susan's murder and her activities in the hours before her death. Anyone with information regarding this case should contact Detective Daniel Grassi of the Homicide Unit at 302-365-8441 or daniel.grassi@delaware.gov. Benjamin Ledyard is headed to prison for 2 years in connection with the domestic beating of his wife Stephanie a year ago. The 56-year-old Ledyard pled guilty to second-degree assault in August 2023. He was sentenced on Friday, December 22, 2023. The Delaware Department of Justice stated after his release from prison Ledyard will have 6 months of Level 4 probation, home confinement, or a DOC probation facility, followed by 18 months of Level 3 probation. He is also required to receive continuing treatment for alcoholism. When Paislee Shultis disappeared from Cayuga Heights near Ithaca, New York, on July 13, 2019, her family was inconsolable. While police suspected that the 4-year-old had been kidnapped by her biological parents, who had lost custody of her, Kimberly Cooper and Kirk Shultis Jr., the hunch would take nearly 3 years to confirm. The now 7-year-old girl was found alive and in good health in the home of her biological father in Saugerties, New York, on Monday. Detectives had long believed she was being kept there, with prior visits typically resulting in Shultis Jr. Cooper and Kirk Shultis Esser providing limited access to the residence. Police finally obtained enough factual information for a search warrant on February 14th. They spent an hour combing the house before a detective noticed that the basement stairs were oddly built. Saugerties Police Chief Joseph Sinagra said both Cooper and Paislee were hiding in a small space within. There was something about the staircase that bothered him. The child never made a sound. Kimberly never made a sound. The question that needs to be answered is what she was told by her parents that would keep her so still and quiet while the cops are walking up and down the steps, while they're taking the steps apart. Before the kidnapping, Paislee was raised in the quiet village of Cayuga Heights on the outskirts of Ithaca. She experienced 4 short years of normalcy before Shultis Jr. and Cooper lost custody of her and her older sister. We believe what happened after that point was that somebody informed the parents that the older child had been picked up by the legal guardian and by county officials at the time, and that caused the parents then to take Paislee and flee, explained Sinagra. Authorities certainly suspected Shultis Jr. and Cooper from the beginning, and they would even receive numerous tips about the Saugerties home throughout their years-long investigation. Sinagra said that every visit police ever paid the couple, however, was met with adversarial claims that officers were harassing and badgering them. While they were admonished and told they should be looking for Paislee, the officers were occasionally allowed inside. This happened roughly a dozen times over the last 2.5 years. But Shultis Jr., his live-in father, or Cooper always limited any access to bedrooms or the basement. And since authorities did not have a warrant, they could not search farther. We're bothered by the fact that this went on for 2 years, said Sinagra. They lied to us for 2 years, including the father stating that he had no idea where his daughter was. The tables turned mere days ago when police received another tip. All the information they had previously received was hearsay that they were unable to act on. This new tip is unspecified. However, it contained factual evidence that the girl was hidden in the house. With the new information, the Saugerties Police Department was at last able to obtain a warrant. Officers arrived at 4 p.m. on Monday to ensure that nobody left the property, and executed the search warrant to shocking results at 8 p.m. Officers discovered a room in the basement for the first time during their search. It held a bed that appeared to have been slept in, and Paislee's name was written on one of the walls. The homeowners denied knowledge of her whereabouts and claimed they merely had her room ready in case she was ever found. We asked, "Is she here?" And they denied that anybody was living in that house, in that particular room, said Sinagra. They said they had set the room up like that in the event that Paislee should ever return. Around 9 p.m., Detective Eric Thiel spotted what looked like a blanket after pointing his flashlight through a crack in the wooden staircase. Thiel and his colleagues began pulling the steps apart and saw 2 tiny feet. Then they pulled out Paislee. She had lain in the compartment alongside Cooper in silence for over an hour. After removing several more steps, the child and her abductor were discovered within, the police said. The space was small, cold, and wet. The child and her abductor, Kimberly Cooper, were found hiding in the dark and wet enclosure. Sinagra said this makeshift hiding space was probably used every time authorities paid Shultis Jr., his father, and Cooper a visit. with a door in Paislee's basement bedroom leading to a short hallway connecting to the compartment that appeared more than likely. Ultimately, police arrested all 3 adults involved. Cooper is facing charges of custodial interference in the 2nd degree and endangering the welfare of a child. Shultis Jr. and his father were both charged with the same crimes, but their custodial interference was classified in the 1st degree, and thus a felony. All 3 were ordered to stay away from Paislee. Alive and physically well, the girl was returned to her legal guardians. Fortunately for her, those who saved her stopped at McDonald's on the drive back to the police station. Police say the investigation is ongoing and additional arrests are still pending. On May 16, 2022, Edna Suttles, 80, a beloved mom and member of a tight-knit South Carolina community, was found buried on a remote wooded property in North Carolina. A single working mother, Suttles raised 3 children in Travelers Rest, South Carolina. At age 80, she worked as a home care assistant. When she failed to show up for an appointment with a client, alarm bells rang. Edna Suttles was reported missing from Greenville County in August 2021. She was a grandmother of 6 and great-grandmother of 12. She was the owner of a 1 bail bonding, making her the first woman bail bondsman in South Carolina. Federal investigators became involved in the search for Suttles, and a federal search warrant, unsealed in March, shows detectives found surveillance video of suspect Daniel Prince getting into her Jeep at the Food Lion in Travelers Rest on the day she went missing. The warrant said Suttles' belongings, including a purse and her Jeep keys, were found hidden in a bee-box on Prince's property on Kaiser Road in Rutherford County. In the bee-box, investigators say they also found rope, zip ties, and rubber gloves. In May, her body was found in a wooded area off of Harris-Holly Springs Road in Rutherfordton, North Carolina. According to a new federal criminal complaint that was unsealed, federal agents say Prince has a prior conviction for kidnapping in Michigan and is a person of interest in the disappearances of other elderly women. Investigators say they identified Prince through his Food Lion frequent shopper card. According to the court documents, when investigators initially questioned Prince about Suttles, he told them he was a handyman and considered Suttles a friend, but denied involvement in her disappearance. In October 2021, a cadaver dog was brought to Prince's property and alerted to a strong scent of human decomposition on a vehicle panel from Suttles' car and Prince's wife's car, which they say he used in kidnapping Suttles. At Prince's home, investigators say they found pill bottles for cyclobenzaprine, tramadol, and lorazepam that were prescribed to 66-year-old Nancy Rigo, a woman missing out of Charlotte, a yogurt container found in the bee-box with Suttles' belongings that was bought at the Travelers Rest Food Lion on the day she disappeared tested positive for these drugs. According to federal investigators, Prince was captured on surveillance video moving Suttles, who was motionless, to his wife's vehicle outside the Food Lion in Travelers Rest and wiping down Suttles' Jeep, according to the court documents. Federal investigators say that after kidnapping and drugging Suttles, Prince zip-tied her and suffocated her with a bag. When Prince was questioned again in October, he told investigators he wanted to come clean about his sins and would relay details to a defense attorney about the deaths of 5 different people. Dolores Sellers died at home in 2017 at 88 years old. She lived in Charlotte but was born in Loris, South Carolina. She had 2 children and was a wonderful mother, said Justin Holloway, Assistant U.S. Attorney for the District of South Carolina. She was beautiful. She loved to sing and reminded family and friends of Elizabeth Taylor. Investigators say they later determined Sellers was killed by a lethal dose of prescription medication administered by Prince. Sellers' daughter, Nancy Rigo, is also a victim of Prince. She was a massage therapist who lived in Charlotte near her mother. She will be remembered mostly for her laughs, for her love and her spirit full of life. Holloway said. That infectious laugh is what her family members will so fondly remember. Prince shot Rigo to death in 2018. According to the court records, Prince was listed as having power of attorney for Rigo's bank account, which continued to receive Social Security deposits and had transactions almost every day after her disappearance. All daily transactions on Rigo's bank account stopped after Prince was arrested, according to the FBI. Rigo's family has received emails from someone claiming to be her since she disappeared, but the person always declined to meet or speak with the family. Leigh Goodman, a mother of 4 and an occupational therapist, died in 2018 at 61 years old. Leigh's love for the beach was surpassed by her love for her children. She never had it easy, but she didn't let life's hardships get in her way. Holloway said Goodman died within days of meeting Prince. Law enforcement believed that by late August 2021, Prince had established an online friendship with Suttles. He went to Traveler's Rest, laced her yogurt with a lethal mix of painkillers, and placed the bag over her face, they theorized. On June 22, 2022, Prince pleaded guilty to kidnapping and murdering Edna Suttles. He also confessed to killing Leigh Goodman, 61, Nancy Rigo, 66, and Nancy's mother Dolores Sellers, 88. Prince is serving a life sentence without the chance of parole. On August 15, 2009, the tiny Middle Eastern nation of Kuwait witnessed the deadliest civilian tragedy in the country's history that would send shockwaves through the country. The tragedy would forever be ingrained in the minds of Kuwaitis and lead to one of the only times the nation implemented the death penalty on a woman. 23-year-old Nasra Al-Enezi and her 36-year-old husband, Zaid Zafiri, were a prosperous pair with 2 children, aged 5 and 3. According to Kuwaiti law, men are permitted to have multiple wives, and in August 2009, Zaid Zafiri decided to enter into a second marriage. Nasra was less than thrilled about this, but did not have many options available to her, but to let it happen. Divorce is heavily discouraged and considered shameful in the Islamic faith, which the couple adhered to. On the night of August 15, 2009, friends and family members gathered to celebrate the wedding. In Kuwait, it is a tradition for weddings to be segregated based on gender, with the bride, her female guests, and young children in a private tent. The men would be close by celebrating in another location. On this fatal night, the female tent was packed with over 100 guests, dancing, eating, and celebrating with their loved ones. The tent was suddenly engulfed in flames, with only one exit. In a panic, the guests tried to flee, causing a stampede. Unfortunately, many who were not able to escape were trapped inside. It took only 3 minutes for the entire tent to burn down. These 3 minutes resulted in the deaths of 57 women and children, and left 90 more injured. The initial death toll was 42 victims, but over the year, it rose to 57. Many victims were hospitalized for long, agonizing months before finally dying as a result of their injuries. The bodies were so badly charred that authorities called forensic specialists to identify the victims. It didn't take long for authorities to realize that someone deliberately started this fire. They found their suspect to be 23-year-old Nasra Al-Enezi. A witness at the scene, a woman who was later identified as Nasra's maid, testified that she saw Nasra pour gasoline around the tent. When police apprehended her, she confessed to pouring petrol and setting the tent on fire. The wedding that Nasra confessed to setting on fire was her husband's wedding to his second wife. In Kuwait, a man is permitted legally and religiously to marry more than one wife. Nasra's husband was celebrating his wedding to his second younger bride. Nasra claimed physical and mental abuse at the hands of her husband, and his relatives drove her to set the tent on fire. The authorities, based on the physical evidence and Nasra's testimony, labeled this arson a premeditated crime, with the primary motive being revenge. Both the bride and groom survived the fire unharmed. The initial reaction to the death of 57 women and children was grief, followed soon by anger. People were angry and demanded punishment for the person responsible. Nasra's lawyer believed that public opinion played a role in the trial's outcome, and the verdict was already decided by the intense public reaction. Nasra soon redacted her confession and claimed that she only poured cursed water around the tent, not gasoline. However, the witness testimony and the evidence contradicted her claim. Some sources reported that murder was never her intention, and she wanted to ruin the celebration. However, the tent's material was highly flammable, and the lack of fire exits caused this tragedy. The investigation concluded that Nasra instigated the fire intentionally. The verdict for the murder in Kuwait is the death penalty. A verdict was almost guaranteed in Nasra's case, since the investigation concluded that the fire was deliberate murder. While the death penalty verdict is common in Kuwait for cases of murder, the judgment is rarely carried forth for women. Another layer to consider in Kuwaiti law is the victim's family's right to retribution. The victims' families can waive their right to retribution and compromise with the accused in a court of law, which will remove the death penalty option. However, considering the high number of victims and nature of the victim's death, not a single family member waived their right to retribution. Another exception was pregnancy. According to Kuwaiti law, death sentences for pregnant women are commuted to a life sentence. Nasra claimed that she was pregnant with her third child during her incarceration. However, her husband's relative working in the jail forced her to take medication. Unfortunately, this medication caused her to miscarry her child. The husband's relative has since been transferred from the facility. Her lawyer hoped that her young age and mental state would make her eligible for a pardon. But the courts upheld the death penalty out of respect for the deceased, their families, and the survivors living with the physical and mental scars caused by Nasra's actions. Her death penalty was controversial, but not unsurprising, considering the death toll. Some believed that this tragedy could have been prevented by rethinking cultural norms regarding polygamy and the treatment of women in Kuwait. Soon after the tragedy, Kuwait banned wedding tents in the country, citing safety concerns. At the age of 26, Nasra was executed by hanging by the prison authorities on January 25, 2017. On November 29, 2011, Linda Kolman went searching for her husband after learning he had not shown up for work. She drove to the gym in Kingston, New York, where Tom Kolman worked out in the mornings. Linda found his lifeless body slumped back in the driver's seat of his sedan in the rear parking lot. The seat was almost fully reclined, and his pants were undone. It was in the Kingston Planet Fitness parking lot in Ulster County, New York. There was nothing in the car that would suggest anything of him being attacked, or anything obvious of physical trauma, said the detective. The car's location caught the attention of fellow Detective Brian Revy and Lieutenant Kyle Berardi. It wasn't parked near a building. That's the strange thing, Detective Revy said. If you're going to work out in the morning, you're going to park close to the building. I think we were interested, Lieutenant Berardi added. This whole case was odd. In Colorado, 1,800 miles away, Tom's ex-wife, Michelle Coleman Weber, couldn't believe that Tom, who seemed healthy, had died. Tom's dead, I couldn't process it, she said. Never crossed my mind that it could be anything other than something tragic, health-related. Michelle and Tom had been divorced for 12 years, but they remained close. They had 2 children, Jillian, who was then 15, and Bradley, who was 17. She had to tell the kids their father was dead. I didn't know how I was going to say it, so I just figured just get it over with, said Coleman Weber. Nearly 4 years later, in October 2015, law enforcement authorities arrested dentist Gilberto Nunes. charging him with the second-degree murder of Tom Kolman, in addition to forgery charges for possessing fake Central Intelligence Agency documents. Detectives had collected circumstantial evidence suggesting that Nunez killed Tom, who suffered from sleep apnea, with a fatal dose of the sedative midazolam. Investigators also speculated Nunez had an incriminating motive for wanting to kill his then best friend. Nunez, who was in the process of separating from his wife, had been carrying on a nearly year-long love affair with Linda and wanted Tom Kolman out of the way. The homicide, which made national TV news, shocked residents of Kingston, a suburban city 90 miles north of New York City. In 2016, during Nunez's trial, Nanny sat through roughly 2 weeks of testimony that included Linda taking the stand to recount the intimate details of her 11-month fling with the dentist and his deceptive efforts to expose their relationship to Tom. The Kolmans and Nunez had children who attended school and karate classes together, which resulted in the trio striking up a friendship, Linda testified. After she began her affair with Nunez, she recounted, she began receiving text messages in early 2011 from a woman claiming to be having sex with Tom. Linda asked Nunez to help her verify whether the texts were authentic, because he had told her he was in the CIA, she said in court. The dentist provided her with a letter supposedly written by one of his colleagues at the agency, Linda told jurors. The letter allegedly confirmed Tom's extramarital affair, but also, oddly, advised her to forgive her husband. In July 2011, Tom learned about the affair between his wife and his best friend, but the love triangle continued, Linda testified. She also said Tom and Nunez became even closer pals, with her husband telling her at one point Nunez was the best friend he ever had. During the homicide investigation, detectives learned that Nunez had a burner phone he was using to send text messages to Tom and Linda, accusing both of them of cheating on each other. Nunez admitted to sending the messages, and he owned up to creating the CIA letter. During the court proceedings, prosecutor Mariellen Albanese laid out her theory that Nunez had become so obsessed with Linda that he created an elaborate scheme to break up her marriage. The plot included sending the text messages from a phony lover, the fake CIA document, and an email in which Nunez allegedly pretended to be his own mother, pleading with Linda to leave Tom. When his effort failed, Nunez decided to kill Tom, Albanese said. Albanese presented physical evidence, such as what appeared to be Nunez's SUV arriving and leaving the gym parking lot around the same time Tom was there, an internet search for midazolam on the dentist's computer, and 2 unopened vials of the drug found in an emergency kit in his office. Law enforcement officials had also twice exhumed Tom's body, finding traces of midazolam in one of his eyes during the second disinterment, Nanny says. The theory they ultimately came up with is that Nunez slipped midazolam into Tom Kolman's coffee, leaned his best friend back in his car seat, and tilted his head up so he couldn't breathe. Nanny says, they clearly had a tough time making their case. Albanese did not respond to requests for comment. The prosecution's case against his client was weak, says Evan Lipton, one of the criminal defense attorneys who represented Nunez. Our argument to the jury was not only that Gill didn't kill Kolman, but that there was no murder. It was a natural death. The defense team called its own expert pathologist, who testified that Tom Kolman's heart was ready to burst, and that this was a more likely explanation for the death, Lipton says. Another defense witness, a pharmacologist, testified that the dosage amount of midazolam prosecutors claimed Nunez had given Tom wasn't enough to kill him, Lipton recalls. They failed to follow leads that suggested Kolman may have been meeting up with strangers, Lipton says, referring to recent emails Tom had received from a hookup website called Benati.com. We used these facts to undercut their argument that Gill is the only other person who could have been in the parking lot that night. On June 17, 2016, the jury acquitted Nunez of murdering Tom Kolman, but convicted him on the felony counts for forgery in connection with the fake CIA documents. The medical evidence presented by the defense that Tom Kolman had an enlarged heart muddied the waters about the cause of death, Nanny says. The prosecution was also having a difficult time proving Nunez was there at the scene. There was still reasonable doubt. As far as the forgery charges, there was no denying the CIA documents were phony, noted Nanny, who is now a Bloomberg reporter. The prosecution had called an information technology technician who maintained the servers at Nunez's dentistry office. He testified that Nunez asked him to pose as a CIA agent, Nanny says. Nunez tried to pay two people $500 to pretend to be CIA agents and have them approach Linda and Tom Kolman in the months leading up to his death. The same year he beat the murder rap, Nunez stood for another 2 trials on unrelated criminal charges of insurance fraud and perjury. He was found guilty in both those proceedings. In February 2017, Ulster County Court Judge Donald Williams sentenced Nunez to 2 1/3 to 7 years in state prison. Williams also denied Nunez's request to regain his dentistry license upon his release. During the sentencing hearing, the judge admonished Nunez as an individual who was consumed by an illicit affair, willing to do absolutely anything to promote his prurient interests. In 2018, Nunez was released after serving 19 months at Altona Correctional Facility in New York with a clean disciplinary record. Nunez is on parole until October 2, 2023. Lipton stated he remains in contact with Nunez, who had his license to practice dentistry revoked by a New York State Review Board, but declined to comment on the ex-dentist's current occupation and what he's been up to the past 5 years. In 2014, Nunez remarried a woman named Yamil, a real estate agent in the Kingston area. In 2006, Lori Vallow Daybell married businessman Charles Vallow. Friends say it appeared to be a happy marriage. Together, the couple was raising Paislee Ryan, Lori's daughter from a previous marriage. Lori and Charles Vallow adopted J.J. Vallow. He was the grandson of Charles' sister. J.J. had autism, and April Raymond, who was Lori's friend, says Lori was patient, an ideal mother for him. Vasia Itayahal met the Vallow family when they lived in Arizona. She says, Paislee embraced her role as a big sister, that Paislee even jokingly referred to JJ as her own child. Sometime around 2017, relatives say Lori Vallow's relationship with her children changed. Her friends say she had been reading the books of doomsday author Chad Daybell. Daybell, who wrote several fiction books about preparing for the end of the world, lived outside Rexburg, Idaho. In 2019, Charles Vallow became very worried about Lori, and he went to the police with his concerns. He told them Lori believed she was a god preparing for the end of days. He also said Lori had threatened to murder him. Charles Vallow filed for a divorce from Lori. In court documents, Charles expressed that he feared for his and the children's safety. Charles Vallow went to the house where Lori Vallow was living with the children in Chandler, Arizona. Charles was supposed to drop their son JJ off at school, but when he went inside the home, Charles was shot dead by Lori's brother, Alex Cox. Cox told police that Lori and Charles got into a fight. Alex claimed he was protecting his sister and shot Charles in self-defense. Lori and Paislee, who both say they heard the shooting, told similar stories of self-defense. Lori Vallow moved closer to Chad Daybell. She relocated her kids to Rexburg, Idaho. Lori's brother, Alex Cox, moved into the same apartment complex. Lori Vallow, Paislee, JJ, and Alex Cox went to Yellowstone National Park. Police say this is where the last known photo of Paislee was taken before she vanished. Melanie Gibb has said that Lori had referred to Paislee as a zombie. The morning after Paislee Ryan disappeared, investigators say that Alex Cox's cell phone GPS placed him in Chad Daybell's backyard, on the property for about 2 hours. About 14 minutes after Cox's GPS showed him leaving the property, Chad Daybell texted his wife, Tammy Daybell. The text read, "I spotted a big raccoon along the fence. I hurried and got my gun, and he was still walking along. I got close enough that one shot did the trick. He is now in our pet cemetery." Police say J.J. Vallow was last seen on September 22, 2019. Melanie Gibbs says that she and her boyfriend David Warwick were staying with Lori Vallow in Rexburg that weekend. On the night of September 22nd, Warwick says he saw Alex Cox carry J.J. into Lori's apartment. But the next morning, according to Warwick, when he asked to see J.J., Lori reportedly told them that J.J. was being a zombie and that Cox had to take him away. The day after J.J. was last seen, investigators say Alex Cox's cell phone showed that Cox returned to Chad Daybell's backyard. This time, Cox was there for only 17 minutes. With Lori Vallow's children's whereabouts unknown, tragedy struck Chad Daybell's family. Daybell's wife, Tammy Daybell, died. The couple's son, Garth Daybell, said Tammy died in bed and that he and Chad called 911. The Daybell children declined an autopsy. They say the coroner told them Tammy's death appeared to be natural causes. They believed that because they say their mom was in ill health prior to her death. Roughly 2 weeks later, Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell got married on a beach in Hawaii. Later that month, JJ's grandmother, Kay Woodcock, asked police to check on JJ's welfare. Woodcock said she was concerned and hadn't heard from JJ in months. Rexburg police went to Lori Vallow Daybell's house, looking for JJ. Police say Vallow Daybell lied to them, claiming that JJ was safe and staying in Arizona with her friend, Melanie Gibb. At first, Gibb wasn't forthcoming about JJ's whereabouts, but later called police and told them JJ hadn't been with her. While Rexburg police attempted to locate JJ, investigators soon realized that his sister, Tylee Ryan, was also missing and launched a nationwide search for the children. While investigators searched for the missing children, Lori and Chad Daybell traveled back to Hawaii. In December 2019, Fremont County Sheriff's investigators grew suspicious about Tammy Daybell's death. They exhumed her body to conduct an autopsy. That same month, Lori's brother, Alex Cox, died in Arizona. It was determined he died of natural causes. Authorities served Lori Vallow Daybell an order requiring her to produce her children. After failing to comply, Lori Vallow Daybell was arrested in Hawaii. 2 weeks later, she was extradited to Idaho. Even after Vallow Daybell's arrest, the couple refused to say where the children were. On June 9, 2020, the FBI Rexburg Police and Fremont County Sheriff's Office descended upon Chad Daybell's home and property. Authorities dug in areas of the backyard where Alex Cox's cell phone had pinged in September 2019. Tragically, they uncovered human remains buried in shallow graves. J.J. Vallow had been buried under a tree, and about 50 yards away, investigators found Tylee's grave in the Daybell's pet cemetery. Prosecutors believe she was buried in the same location Chad Daybell referenced when he texted Tammy Daybell 9 months earlier, saying he was burying a raccoon. Investigators dug up part of the pet cemetery and found no raccoon. But Daybell's family stated there was a second pet cemetery on the property that was not searched. Chad Daybell was arrested. Authorities later confirmed that they identified the remains as J.J. Vallow and Tylee Ryan. A memorial was built along the Daybell's fence to honor the victims. In May 2021, Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow Daybell were charged with first-degree murder for the deaths of J.J. and Tylee. Daybell was also charged with murdering his first wife, Tammy Daybell. Chad Daybell pleaded not guilty to all the charges. Lori Vallow Daybell was also charged with conspiring to murder Charles Vallow. That same month, a judge ruled Lori incompetent to stand trial while she receives mental health treatment. She had not yet entered a plea. Her case was on hold. In August 2021, prosecutors announced they will seek the death penalty against Chad Daybell. Daybell is jailed, awaiting trial. Chad and Tammy Daybell's children said they believe their father is innocent. Daybell's daughter, Emma Murray, says she believes Chad was framed by Alex Cox and Lori Vallow Daybell. In April 2022, Judge Stephen Boyce ruled Lori Vallow Daybell is now mentally competent to stand trial in the Idaho murder case. He did not provide other details about her treatment or mental condition. She is scheduled to be formally arraigned in court next week, and both Lori and Chad Daybell are set to stand trial together early next year. Lori Vallow Daybell refused to enter a plea to murder and other charges, prompting Judge Stephen Boyce to enter a not guilty plea on her behalf. Vallow Daybell and her husband, Chad Daybell, were both at the courthouse in the eastern Idaho town of St. Anthony for court proceedings. Vallow Daybell for an arraignment that was delayed for months while she underwent treatment at a mental health facility, and Chad Daybell for a hearing over the trial venue. Lori Vallow Daybell will qualify for capital punishment if she is convicted at her trial in May 2022, because the slayings were exceptionally depraved and carried out for financial gain, according to court documents filed by prosecuting attorneys from Fremont and Madison counties on May 2nd. Attorneys for Lori Vallow Daybell asked a judge to send the case back to a grand jury because they say that the conspiracy charges are oddly constructed and could confuse a jury. Daybell and her husband Chad Daybell have pleaded not guilty to murder, conspiracy, and grand theft charges in connection with the deaths of 7-year-old Joshua J.J. Vallow and 17-year-old Tylee Ryan. 7th District Judge Stephen Boyce has banned cameras from the courtroom in the criminal case of Lori Vallow Daybell and Chad Daybell, saying he fears the images could prevent a fair trial. In January 2023, Judge Stephen Boyce rejected a request from Lori Vallow Daybell's attorneys that she and her husband be allowed to meet in person and on the phone to discuss strategies and settlement options. Attorneys for Vallow, Daybell, and Chad Daybell presented several requests during a motion hearing, including that the trial be delayed until 2024, a request from Chad Daybell's attorneys, and that the death penalty be taken off the table, a request from Lori Vallow Daybell's lawyers. Prosecutors were seeking the death penalty for both defendants, but Lori Vallow Daybell's attorneys said it should be taken off the table in her case because they will not have time to fully review a large amount of evidence that was turned over in recent weeks. During a hearing, Judge Stephen Boyce agreed. He noted that Vallow Daybell has not waived her right to a speedy trial, so the proceeding could not be rescheduled to give her defense team ample time to review the evidence. The death penalty still applies to Chad Daybell's case. Attorneys began selecting 18 potential jurors for the trial of Lori Vallow Daybell, charged in what prosecutors say was a doomsday-focused plot. Authorities summoned 1,800 potential jurors to the courthouse in late March of 2023, requiring each of them to complete a 20-page questionnaire in hopes of winnowing out anyone unable to fairly try the case. Ultimately, 12 jurors and 6 alternates are hearing the case. On April 10th, the prosecution and defense in the trial of Lori Vallow Daybell made their opening arguments to a jury in Boise, Idaho. An Idaho jury found Lori Vallow Daybell, the mom charged with murder in the deaths of 2 of her children, 16-year-old Tylee Ryan and 7-year-old Joshua J.J. Vallow, guilty on all charges. Vallow Daybell, 49, was also charged with conspiracy to commit murder in the deaths of the children and the death of her husband's first wife, Tammy Daybell. She was also accused of stealing Social Security payments issued for the children. Chad Daybell will face trial nearly a year after his wife. Judge Stephen Boyce, who is overseeing both cases, set his trial date for April 1, 2024. He too will be tried at the Ada County Courthouse in Boise, Idaho. I will make sure I give an update about him. Lori Vallow Daybell was sentenced to life without parole, the maximum penalty on the charges of murder and conspiracy to commit murder. She was also given a 10-year sentence for grand theft, as well as ordered to pay more than $50,000, including fines, a civil penalty for each of the 3 victims, and restitution. You had so many other options. You could have gotten divorced. You could have found someone else to take care of those kids. And as the state was able to prove at trial, you chose the most evil and destructive path possible, said Judge Stephen Boyce at the sentencing. He added, "You justified all of this by going down a bizarre religious rabbit hole, and clearly you are still down there." Lori Vallow Daybell was charged with conspiracy to commit murder in the 2019 death of her 4th husband, Charles Vallow, who died after police say he was shot by her brother, Alexander Lamar Cox. Cox claimed he shot Vallow in self-defense. Daybell and Cox, who also died in 2019, were also accused of trying to murder her niece's husband, Brandon Boudreaux, who was shot at in 2019 while driving near his home. She also faces a charge of conspiracy to commit murder in that case. Boudreaux was unhurt in the incident. The court entered pleas of not guilty for Daybell on both charges. The murder of Cari Farver is one of the most chilling and bizarre true crime cases in modern American history. The 37-year-old woman from Iowa started a whirlwind romance with Dave Krupa of Omaha, Nebraska in October 2012, and 2 weeks later, she vanished, never to be seen again. Krupa, however, had nothing to do with her mysterious disappearance. Farver was abducted and murdered by Shanna Liz Golyar, a woman Krupa had been casually dating before he met Farver. For the next 3 years, Golyar posed as Farver, sending thousands of text messages and emails to Krupa and Farver's family members. She even sent threatening messages to herself so that Krupa wouldn't catch on to her act. Because the texts and emails were coming from Farver's accounts, it wasn't until 2015 that authorities really started looking into her disappearance. As they began investigating Golyar, they learned the entire ruse went much deeper than anyone could have ever imagined. In 2012, Dave Krupa was working at an auto repair shop in Omaha, Nebraska. At the time, he was hoping for a fresh start in life. He'd just split up with his longtime girlfriend, Amy Flora, with whom he shared 2 children. He soon decided to sign up for an online dating site, where he met Liz Golyar. The two began seeing each other, but before things could get too deep, Krupa reportedly informed Golyar that he wasn't looking for anything serious. Golyar, a single mother, was happy with that arrangement, or so she claimed. Several months after meeting Golyar, Krupa spotted Cari Farver when she walked into his shop. He immediately knew there was something special about her. "When we looked at each other, there was a little spark," Krupa later stated. "She's showing me something inside the vehicle, and we're standing there, and we're very close, and there was some tension." Krupa asked Farver out on a date, where they discussed that neither of them was looking for an exclusive relationship. The two returned to his apartment, and as Farver was leaving later, she passed a woman in the hallway. It was Golyar, who had dropped by unannounced to pick up some of her things. It was this chance meeting, a meeting that couldn't have lasted more than a few seconds, that would change the course of both women's lives. Within weeks of meeting Farver, Dave Krupa was beginning to rethink his commitment to bachelorhood. Farver still wanted to keep things casual, but she did agree to stay with him for a few nights in November 2012. She was working on a major project for her job, and Krupa's apartment was much closer to her office than her home was. The last time anyone saw Cari Farver alive was November 13, 2012. She'd spent the night with Krupa, and he gave her a kiss as she left for work, but she never returned. A few hours later, however, Krupa received an odd text from Farver. She told him she wanted to officially move in with him, despite the fact that they'd just discussed keeping things casual. He politely declined, and he received an angry message in response. He recalled to Oxygen's Dateline, "Secrets uncovered as soon as I text her back. I get a text back that says, 'Fine. I don't ever want to see you again. Go away. I'm dating somebody else. I hate you.' On and on and on." Farver's family started receiving texts as well. Her mother, Nancy Rainey, got a message from Farver saying she had moved to Kansas for a new job and would get in touch to make arrangements about picking up her 15-year-old son, Max. Rainey thought this was strange, but when Farver missed her half-brother's wedding and her father's funeral, she knew something was dreadfully wrong. Authorities reportedly tried to get in touch with Farver, but when they received messages from her number asking them to leave her alone, they dropped it. Ronnie also told them that Farver had previously been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, so investigators assumed she'd stopped taking her medication and vanished of her own accord. It would be years before they realized how wrong they were. On August 17, 2013, Liz Golyer called Dave Krupa in a panic. For months, the two had bonded over the threatening messages they were both receiving from Cari Farver, but now things had seemingly escalated. Golyer said her house had been set ablaze and her beloved pets had perished in the fire. Krupa soon received a text from Farver's number that read, "I am not lying. I set that nasty bit house on fire. I hope the bit and her kids die in it." Krupa also started receiving texts outlining exactly what he was doing or what he was wearing at the moment. Some of these messages would come in while he was in the same room as Golyer and could see that she wasn't using her phone at the time, so he had no reason to suspect she was behind them. When Krupa changed his phone number, the messages abated for a while. In February 2015, he moved to Council Bluffs, Iowa, and he stopped spending as much time with Golyer. It was around this same time that detectives finally began digging deeper into Cari Farver's odd disappearance. In the spring of 2015, detectives Ryan Avis and Jim Doty of the Pottawatomie County Sheriff's Office in Council Bluffs started a full-blown investigation into Farver's whereabouts. According to Distractify, they suspected she was dead, but they weren't sure when or how she died. Investigators had searched Cari Farver's abandoned car shortly after her disappearance. But when they checked it again more thoroughly in 2015, they found bloodstains beneath the fabric of the passenger seat. They downloaded the contents of Krupa's and Golyar's phones for their investigation, and digital forensics discovered something odd. Golyar's device showed evidence that she had photos of Farver's car, 20 to 30 fake email accounts, and an app that allowed her to schedule text messages to be sent at a future time. The detectives zeroed in on Golyar, and when she suspected that they might be onto her, she told them that she thought Krupa's ex-girlfriend Amy Flora had killed Farver and had been the one harassing them all along. Shortly after that very conversation, Golyer called 911 from Big Lake Park in Council Bluffs, saying Flora had shot her in the leg. Unbeknownst to her, Flora had a solid alibi. Golyer's story began to unravel, but the final nail in the coffin came when detectives searched her tablet. On the SD card, police found thousands of deleted images, including one of Cari Farver's decomposing body. Golyer had stabbed Farver to death in her own car on or around November 13, 2012. She then spent 3 years sending 15,000 emails and up to 50,000 text messages, posing as Farver to cover her deadly crime. She even burned down her own house, killed her pets, and shot herself in the leg to carry out her lies. In 2017, Liz Golyer was convicted of first-degree murder and second-degree arson. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dave Krupa was left stunned by how the investigation unfolded. He said of the ordeal, "I want Liz to go away and never do this to anybody again." When Jessica Patel found out she was going to become a mom after 3 failed rounds of in vitro fertilization, It seemed that her dreams had finally come true. But the happy news sealed her fate. Within days, she was brutally murdered by her callous husband, who planned to steal her fertilized embryos and begin a new life in Australia with his gay lover. Pharmacist Mitesh Patel, then 37, also planned to cash in a £2 million life insurance policy and tried to cover up his crime by staging a burglary at the couple's Middlesbrough home. But in December 2018, 7 months after the horrific crime, he was jailed for life for strangling and suffocating his 34-year-old wife. Jessica's two sisters, Divya and Manal, stated they had no idea that Mitesh was abusing Jessica throughout their 9-year marriage until details emerged at the trial. Divya says, "When we found out how he was treating her behind closed door, you feel an enormous sense of guilt that someone who was as kind and gentle as Jessica had suffered. Why couldn't I have protected her better? It's hard because someone as nice as her deserved so much better. This shouldn't have been her fate." The wedding photos from July 2009 show a stunning bride in a beautiful sari, beaming with happiness as she poses alongside her new husband. Jessica and Mitesh started dating while studying pharmaceuticals at university, and he seemed the perfect boyfriend, showering her with romantic gifts and cuddly toys. When he proposed in 2009, the family thought it was too soon, but Jessica persuaded them. Mitesh and his family, strict Hindus, were keen not to wait. Jess was always very patient and calm, says Divya. She was always fun to be around. She had a great sense of humor. Liked to be silly, but she was also quite girly. We used to watch a lot of Bollywood movies when we were younger, and there was always a boy and a girl falling in love. Some romantic love story. She always fantasized about falling in love and having a family. The couple's lavish wedding in the garden of Jessica's family home in Leeds seemed the perfect start to their new life. But groom Mitesh was hiding a dark secret and already leading a double life, hooking up with men on Grindr behind his new wife's back. The marriage was merely a sham to hide his true sexuality from his religious parents and the wider Hindu community. Within a year, Jessica's family began to notice cracks in the relationship. She told her sisters she felt neglected by Mitesh, and that, after being attentive before the wedding, he had backed off as soon as they were wed. Cousin Gayatri Patel said. She mentioned that they had not had a sexual relationship for 10 months. That came as quite a shock. They'd not been married long at that point. At the same time, he became increasingly controlling. When her terminally ill granddad was put in palliative care in February 2010, the family kept a vigil by his bedside, but Jessica, who was close to him, only made fleeting visits. Sister Manal says Jessica told her, "Mitesh won't let me stay." She adds, "She said they had gotten to an argument in the car over it and he had hit her." Jessica also told her sisters he sometimes throttled her and was constantly secretive. If he was on the phone when she walked into the room to go to bed, he would walk out and continue the conversation in one of their loft rooms upstairs, says Manal. He wouldn't come back down to bed sometimes until 4 a.m. Within 2 years of the marriage, Mitesh began a passionate affair with Dr. Amit Patel, who he met on Grindr. Cruel Mitesh even invited his lover to stay, introducing him as a friend. Soon afterwards, Mitesh announced he had bought a pharmacy business in Middlesbrough, and the couple were moving 60 miles from her family. Desperate to make the marriage work, Jessica saw the move as a fresh start. But Mitesh continued to see Amit and was still active on gay dating apps. Pressure was also mounting on the couple to have a family, and, after 6 years in a sexless marriage, Jessica agreed to try IVF. Chillingly, Mitesh was already plotting to start a family with his lover, using his wife's embryos. Texting Amit, he told him Jessica was undergoing IVF and asked, "Will you stand by me?" Amit replied, "She might not even get pregnant. We'll deal with it when it happens." Mitesh also hinted that Jessica would cease to stand in their way if she went earlier than you think. In 2016, Amit emigrated to Australia, and Mitesh began to fantasize about a new life with his lover down under. He even texted his lover, "I'm telling you, her days are marked." Pushed into 3 rounds of IVF in 2 years, Jessica found the process heartbreaking and exhausting. After each failed attempt, she said to me, "I can't do this. It's too painful." Her mental health suffered. "It was quite a struggle," says Manal. She suffered with anxiety and having regular panic attacks. The 4th round proved a success, and on May 9, 2018, the couple were told 3 embryos had been fertilized and would be implanted the following month. On a visit to her family, 4 days later, she was bubbling with the news. She was absolutely ecstatic, says Manal. The chance to become a mother was finally on her, and her dreams were all coming true. But just a day later, she was dead. After working late at the pharmacy, on the night of May 14, 2018, Jessica returned home at 7:10 p.m. As she walked through the door, she was attacked by her husband, who forced a Tesco bag over her head to suffocate her. Before strangling her with such force, he broke the bones in her voice box. Jessica fought back, scratching his neck, but it took just 20 minutes to squeeze the life from her. Mitesh then bound her feet and hands with duct tape and ransacked the house before driving to the local pizza restaurant, where he texted his wife's phone to tell her he was picking up their order. CCTV footage from the restaurant shows the callous killer chatting amiably to staff as his wife lay dead on the living room floor. At 8:22 p.m., Mitesh called 999 from the couple's home, telling the operator, "I think we've been burgled and my wife's been attacked. I just went out to get something to eat and the house has been ransacked. She's just on the floor and she's got duct tape all over her, and she's unconscious."
Police emergency.
Oh, hiya. I think we've been burgled and my wife's been attacked. Well, I've just come home. I was just out. I went to get something to eat and see the lads at work and get my laptop. And I've just come home and the house is ransacked. And she's just on the floor. She's got duct tape all over her and she's unconscious.
When police arrived on the scene, Mitesh showed them the ransacked rooms and once again claimed Jessica had died at the hands of a burglar. Even the family didn't suspect a thing, comforting Mitesh just 2 days after the murder in a visit to the house. I walked straight up to him, sat down on the sofa and went to hug him, says Manal. He immediately buried his head in my shoulder. At that point, I thought he was genuinely crying. Dad Jay added, "Why would somebody do this?" Jessica was not the sort of person who would confront anybody. But not for one moment was I thinking Mitesh could have done this. I was comforting him. I held his hand. He let me do all that. The police, however, were not so easily fooled, and a series of blunders soon led them to Mitesh. Despite his insistence of a break-in, police could find no evidence of forced entry, and a health app on Mitesh's home tracked him, running frantically up and down the stairs as he ransacked the house. A clear breakthrough came when a search of the pharmacy unearthed 4 syringes of insulin and duct tape, later proved to match the tape used to bind Jessica. The hard drive, containing CCTV footage of the couple's home security cameras, clearly showed Jessica and Mitesh were the only people to enter the house that night. 3 days after the murder, Mitesh was arrested and charged. The family, stunned at the news, had more shocks to come at the trial. When Mitesh's sordid affairs, his romance with Amit, and his incredible plot to steal the embryos was laid bare. "We only knew 5% of what came out in that trial," says Manal. 95% of what was said was a complete shock to us. There's no suggestion that his lover believed Mitesh would murder his wife. But cruel texts read out in court included one to Amit, which simply read, "Her days are numbered." He'd used Jess as a cover-up, says Manal. He described Jess as a leaseholder whose lease would one day come to an end. He quite clearly never cared for her. They also heard of cruelty on a daily basis, with pharmacy workers testifying that he called her stupid and told people she was pregnant with twins and had lost them, which was untrue. Jailing Mitesh for a minimum of 30 years, the judge said. This was a brutal attack on a quiet and gentle woman who was prepared to put her trust and faith in her marriage, despite your behavior towards her. You have no remorse for your actions. The only pity you have is for yourself. A harrowing 000 call has revealed the horror and distress of the woman who found the body of a murdered Brazilian mining executive floating in Sydney Harbor. Young, independent, and intelligent, Cecilia Haddad had just left Brazil and started an exciting new life in Australia. But on April 29, 2018, Haddad's strangled body was found floating face down in the shallow waters of Lane Cove River. When Haddad's best friends heard the news, they were shocked and devastated, but also felt incredibly guilty. Carol Camara and Rita Maciel knew Haddad was being stalked and harassed by her ex-boyfriend, Brazilian national Marcelo Santoro. Thousands of texts revealed that Haddad had broken up with Santoro about 10 days before she died, threatening she would call the police if he didn't move out of her apartment because she was fearful of his jealous and overbearing behavior. They begged her to go to the police, but when she refused, they didn't push. One time, he had forced himself into her apartment, Camara stated. She ran into the bedroom and she locked herself in. She got all the furniture she had around her and barricaded herself into the bedroom. She was shouting at him to leave and he was punching the door in. But he was telling her, "I just want to talk to you. You just need to listen." The last time Camara and Maciel saw Haddad was 1 week before the tragedy when Haddad visited them in Perth. When she returned from the trip, Haddad was stunned to find that Santoro had been letting himself into her Sydney apartment after secretly cutting himself a key. Despite her friend's plea to report him to the police, Haddad was adamant Santoro would never hurt her. And with Santoro being a Brazilian citizen, Haddad also did not want him to be deported. She didn't want him to have a record. She wanted him gone, but she didn't wish him bad, Camara said. Now Camara regrets not reporting him to the police herself. "I blame myself for what happened to Cecilia," she said. "I would have done so much better for my friend if I knew she was in danger." Finally feeling she was safe enough in her own home after discovering Santoro had booked a flight home to Brazil, Haddad returned to her apartment for the first time on April 28, 2018. But tragically, this was the day she was murdered by her abusive ex-boyfriend Santoro. Santoro came over to Haddad's apartment early that morning, insisting to come in. Haddad refused. After waiting around her apartment block for a few hours, he used his newly cut key to let himself in. Haddad was killed a few minutes after 10 a.m. The body of the 38-year-old was found the next day by panicked kayakers who immediately called emergency services. "We've found a body in the water," Christine Baird screamed as she sobbed uncontrollably in the call. The operator adopts a soothing tone, telling Mrs. Baird to stay on the phone, and asks Mrs. Baird if she knows who the body belongs to. The response is a despairing no. "Her body is floating upside down in the water," Mrs. Baird says in a wavering voice. "I think it's a young woman. Yeah, maybe about 20. I think she's a young girl who didn't come home last night. I just feel sick for her family. I've got teenage daughters." Mrs. Haddad had been weighed down with gym weights in the pockets of her khaki cargo pants, but her body still found its way to the riverbank. Police spent months building the case against Santoro, who fled to Brazil 36 hours after he murdered Haddad. New South Wales police detectives stated they had an abundance of incriminating evidence for Haddad's murder, including CCTV cameras at Santoro's home. It's not only CCTV on the front of the house, but also out the back, Detective John Edwards told Christine Ahern. Through these cameras, they were able to track Santoro's moves in the 48 hours before the murder and straight after. Detectives also gathered accounts from friends and family about Haddad's relationship with Santoro. Edwards and his partner Hannah Packer from the New South Wales Police used mobile towers to trace Santoro's phone on the night, then matched the movement with CCTV footage gathered from homes and businesses along the way. Santoro's phone connected with a cell tower, and we can trace him driving down to the waterfront, Edwards explained, showing a tracking map. We believe Santoro drove all over, and when he didn't find anywhere appropriate, he kept driving around the waterfront, looking for somewhere to dump the body. But the overwhelming and unimpeachable evidence the detectives gathered so far was not their last hurdle. The day after dumping Haddad's body in the river, Santoro fled Sydney and returned to his hometown in Rio de Janeiro. Because Australia does not have extradition treaties with Brazil, police could not arrest Santoro and charge him with her murder in New South Wales. An international manhunt involving Interpol and Australian and Brazilian officials ended with the arrest of Santoro 3 months after Haddad's death. And it was only after 4 years, in June 2023, when Santoro's trial was heard. At a Brazilian federal court trial where New South Wales detectives Hannah Packer and John Edwards presented evidence from their investigation, Santoro confessed to strangling Haddad to her death, but insisted it was an accident. 2 days later, the 7-person jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to 27 years in prison. The former engineer was convicted of aggravated homicide, asphyxiation, femicide, and concealment of a corpse. Santoro earlier admitted to the court he was responsible for Mrs. Haddad's death, going into disturbing detail about strangling her. He confessed to the crime on the second day of the trial. Santoro revealed he had gone to Miss Haddad's Ryde apartment without her permission, where the pair then got into an argument. He told the court he wanted to shut her up and grabbed her around the neck and squeezed very hard until she fell into his arms. She fell limp in my arms. I don't remember if she hit her head on the floor. I picked her up, desperate, and put her on the sofa. She wouldn't wake up, he said, breaking down in tears, as reported. Mrs. Haddad's mother had to leave the courtroom during Santoro's chilling admission, while her brother sat in the front row, shaking his head. Santoro, who pleaded to Mrs. Haddad's family for forgiveness, had told one of the witnesses, who is his priest, to reveal his confession during the trial. For Haddad's friends, the verdict was just a consolation. Kamara and Maciel said they didn't think Santoro has had remorse for what he did to their friend. He took away a daughter, a sister, and a friend that we're never going to have back, Kamara said. In the early hours of June 23, 1993, a 24-year-old woman named Lorena Bobbitt picked up a kitchen knife, walked into the bedroom where her husband John Bobbitt was sleeping, and cut off his penis. Then, Lorena took the severed appendage and fled the couple's home in Manassas, Virginia. By the next day, news of what Lorena had done to John had begun to spread, first among the police officers who searched for his penis in a field, then by the surgeons who reattached the member to his body, and then by the national media that reported on the shocking story. Men across the country winced in sympathy. Late-night comedians made endless jokes. And in the ensuing criminal trial that captivated the nation, Lorena was cast as a hot-tempered Latina who was enraged by her failing marriage and her husband's inability to sexually satisfy her. The truth, however, was more complex. Lorena Bobbitt's story is less about her husband's penis and more about the toxicity of her marriage, the abuse that she allegedly suffered, and the shards of her American dream. Born in 1969 in Buque, Ecuador, Lorena Bobbitt grew up in Caracas, Venezuela, where she enjoyed a normal and happy childhood as the eldest of 3 children. When she was 15, her life changed after her parents gifted her a trip to the United States for her quinceañera. I feel like, oh wow, this is like another planet, Another place, Lorena stated. I said to myself, oh my God, this is the place I want to be. At first, Lorena's entire family tried to emigrate to the U.S. when that proved impossible. Lorena went alone, getting a student visa in 1987. Along the way, she took English classes, worked as a manicurist, and made friends. Then, in 1988, Lorena met John Bobbitt. At a club for enlisted men near the Quantico Marine Base in Stafford, Virginia, John and Lorena Bobbitt locked eyes for the first time. Both later admitted that their initial attraction was powerful. John spotted Lorena across the room and, to her delight, asked her to dance. I thought John was very handsome, Lorena stated in an interview. Blue eyes. A man in a uniform, you know? He was almost like a symbol, a Marine fighting for the country. I believed in this beautiful country. I was swept off my feet. I wanted my American dream. Lorena and John soon married on June 18, 1989. But Lorena's American dream quickly became a nightmare. When they had sex for the first time, Lorena felt that John was rough. He made decisions without consulting Lorena. And shortly after they wed, John allegedly started hitting her. Lorena later said that John frequently beat her, raped her, and even forced her to get an abortion when she got pregnant. He also bullied her while she was waiting to have the procedure done. Meanwhile, John bounced from job to job, creating financial stress, which Lorena says led her to embezzle $7,200 from her employer, nail salon owner Jana Bissotti. She was the meal ticket and the punching bag, her lawyer later stated. Bissotti agreed, stating in 1993 that Lorena was going to do anything to try to make her marriage work. As time went on, the couple's relationship remained volatile. They split in October 1991, only to reunite just a year later. And less than a year after that, Lorena Bobbitt would become a household name when she cut off John's penis. So, what exactly happened on June 23, 1993? As Lorena Bobbitt tells it, the early morning of June 23rd unfolded much like many others in her marriage. She and John had recently agreed to separate again, but were still living together. And when John came home after a night of drinking, he barged into their bedroom and brutally raped Lorena. Afterward, Lorena said that she went to their kitchen to get a glass of water, and something seemed to snap inside of her. I was thinking many things, she recalled. I was thinking the first time he hit me. I was thinking when he raped me. I was thinking so many things, just really quick. I don't know, I just wanted him to disappear. I just wanted him to leave me alone, to leave my life alone. I don't want to see him anymore. A kitchen knife on the counter caught her eye. She then picked it up, went back to the bedroom, and cut off her sleeping husband's penis. As John stumbled out of bed, terrified and bleeding profusely, Lorena fled in her 1991 Mercury Capri, still clutching her husband's severed appendage. She stated that she didn't even realize that she was holding it at first. I remember I couldn't make a turn because my hands had something on them, and so I tried to turn. But then I saw that I have it in my hand, Lorena explained. I looked at it, and I scream, and I throw it out of the window. Meanwhile, John alerted a friend who'd been staying with the couple to his condition, and the friend quickly took him to a nearby hospital. Lorena eventually went to the house of her employer, who called the police. Once officers arrived, Lorena told them where they could find John's penis, in a grassy field opposite a 7-Eleven. According to reports, they quickly located it, put it on ice, and stored it in a big Bite hot dog box. Incredibly, doctors were able to reattach the appendage after a 9.5-hour surgery. And soon afterward, both John and Lorena Bobbitt became household names as their trials captivated the nation. In the aftermath of the incident, both Lorena and John Bobbitt were arrested. Lorena was charged with malicious wounding. John faced charges of marital sexual assault. Many media organizations questioned whether marital rape was an oxymoron. There were no cameras allowed at John's trial, due to the charge against him, and he was acquitted in November 1993. In contrast, Lorena Bobbitt's trial was a media circus. CNN provided wall-to-wall coverage, and her case prompted comment from the likes of David Letterman, who included Lorena in a top 10 list, and Howard Stern, who defended John, and declared, "I don't even buy that he was raping her. She's not that great looking." Many media organizations also clung to a memorable statement that Lorena had made to police shortly after the incident, when she said, "He always have orgasm, and he doesn't wait for me to have an orgasm. He's selfish. I don't think it's fair, so I pull back the sheets, and then I did it." Lorena's lawyer later said that she was trying to explain the long-term abuse that she'd suffered at John's hands. At her trial, multiple witnesses testified that they'd seen bruises on Lorena inflicted by John, and that they'd witnessed him abusing her. But her orgasm quote convinced many commentators that she'd attacked her husband out of sexual dissatisfaction. John, for his part, claimed that Lorena attacked because he was leaving her. "If she couldn't have me, no one could," he later said in an interview. And there was the green card, too. That didn't come to my mind at the time, but it's obvious. You have to be married to an American citizen for 5 years to get one, and we'd only been married for 4. In the end, Lorena was found not guilty by reason of temporary insanity and ordered to spend 5 weeks at a mental hospital. By 1995, she and John had officially divorced and went their separate ways, in very different paths. After her trial, Lorena Bobbitt was eager to retreat from the spotlight. She started using the name Lorena Gallo again, successfully became an American citizen, and focused on rebuilding her life. Though Playboy offered her $1 million to pose for the magazine, she turned them down. "$1 million is $1 million, she stated. "It would have been amazing, but I wasn't raised that way." Instead, Lorena went back to school, began a romantic relationship with a new man named David Bellinger, which has lasted for more than 20 years, and eventually had a daughter with Bellinger. In 2007, she created a foundation to help victims of domestic abuse, Lorena's Red Wagon. John Bobbitt, however, took a different path. After moving to Las Vegas, he and his infamous penis starred in several porn films. John also rotated through multiple girlfriends, some of whom later accused him of domestic violence. All the while, he seemed fixated on his ex-wife. He continued to write Lorena letters as late as 2019. But Lorena, for her part, has moved on. Looking back at what happened in 1993, she's concluded that most people focused on all the wrong things. Caught up in the can't-miss nature of her trial, they largely ignored the violence she said that she'd suffered at the hands of her husband. The media was focusing only on the penis, the sensationalistic, the scandalous, she stated. But I wanted to shine the light on this issue of spousal abuse. I am not a celebrity. I'm an advocate. In 1989, someone brutally attacked and murdered 14-year-old Stephanie Isaacson on her way to school in Las Vegas. But they left behind a tiny clue. Now, using the remains of just 15 human cells, investigators have finally solved the cold case and named Darren Marchand as her killer. "I'm glad they found who murdered my daughter, Isaacson's mother, who was not named," said in a statement. "I never believed the case would be solved." Indeed, Isaacson's murder case had languished for decades. With no suspects and little evidence, it seemed to get colder with each passing day. That is, until a local philanthropist named Justin Wu offered to pay for the services of a genome sequencing firm. At that point, the Las Vegas police turned over their DNA evidence to Othram, a Texas-based lab that focuses specifically on cold cases. And slowly, Othram began to build a genetic profile based on semen found on Isaacson's shirt. They didn't have much to go on, however. Popular at-home DNA tests often collect up to 1,000 nanograms of DNA. But DNA evidence is harder to detect at crime scenes, where investigators often find only tens to hundreds of nanograms. They had just 12 nanograms of DNA to test in the Isaacson case. In other words, they were tasked with finding a killer based on the smallest DNA sample ever used. Nevertheless, after working with the DNA for 7 months, Othram had a name. They pinpointed Darren Marchand as Stephanie Isaacson's killer. This was a huge milestone, noted Othram Chief Executive David Middleman. When you can access information from such a small amount of DNA, it really opens up the opportunity to so many other cases that have been historically considered cold and unsolvable. Though Marchand had died by suicide in 1995, his identification put an end to the decades-old hunt for who ended Stephanie Isaacson's life that day in 1989. Questions still remain about his motive, however. That afternoon, Isaacson's father grew concerned when Isaacson didn't return home. He called her high school, her friends, and finally, the police. An intensive search soon found Isaacson's body 25 yards off the trail she normally took to school. According to the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, she had significant blunt force trauma injuries, and she had been sexually assaulted. Isaacson had been bludgeoned, raped, and strangled. It appears to be a random attack while she was walking to school, said Lieutenant Ray Spencer. But from there, the case went cold. Investigators chased leads throughout the country, looking into suspects in Washington state, Texas, and Ohio. They tried to use the scant DNA they'd collected at the scene, testing it once in 1998 and once in 2007. The Las Vegas police even uploaded it to a national database. Despite their best efforts, the case went nowhere. It took powerful new DNA technology and Wu's donation to solve the case for good. The DNA evidence led police to Marchand, who, indeed, had a history of violence toward women. In 1986, police arrested Marchand for the fatal strangling of 24-year-old Nanette Vanderberg. He walked free in that case due to a lack of evidence. Marchand's DNA from the case involving Vanderberg was compared to the DNA located in Stephanie's case, and it was a match, the Las Vegas police said in a statement. The Stephanie Isaacson murder is far from the first in which DNA evidence caught a killer, although it did use the smallest sample of DNA to date. Police famously used DNA technology to identify the Golden State Killer, who raped dozens of women and killed 12 people in California between 1976 and 1986. But although DNA evidence can bring closure, it can't always bring justice. As Stephanie Isaacson's mother said in a statement, "It's good to have some closure, but there is no justice for Stephanie at all. We will never have complete closure because nothing will ever bring my daughter back to us." A New Zealand chef who committed the first murder on Norfolk Island in more than a century is set to be released from prison in just weeks. The body of 29-year-old Janelle Patton was found wrapped in a black plastic sheet at the island's Cockpit Waterfall Reserve on Easter Sunday, 2002. Ms. Patton had suffered 64 injuries, including stab wounds, a fractured skull, and broken pelvis, and her death led to a police investigation that made headlines around the world. More than 2 decades later, despite Glenn Peter Charles McNeil's conviction for Ms. Patton's murder, her killing remains a subject of debate in true crime podcasts and among amateur sleuths. McNeil's story about what happened on the day Ms. Patton was killed repeatedly changed after his arrest, and no motive was ever established for her murder. Ms. Patton, who worked in hospitality, had moved to Norfolk Island to escape a bad relationship in Sydney, more than 2 years before her life was taken by McNeil. Relationship troubles continued to befall her, with several failed affairs and occasional angry encounters with local men and women. Ms. Patton was last seen alive on the morning of March 31st, heading off on her daily walk around the island, where her parents had honeymooned. Detectives sent from the Australian mainland had to be sworn in as Norfolk Island constables before they could speak to the 2,771 residents and visitors on the island at the time. Ms. Patton's parents, Ron and Carol, had been visiting Norfolk for Easter when their daughter was murdered and had every reason to believe the crime would be quickly solved. Police knew the names of every person present on the island, which covers just 35 square kilometers and sits about 1,400 kilometers east of Evans Head on the New South Wales north coast. Instead, the hunt for Ms. Patton's killer dragged on for years as islanders insisted it could not be one of them, despite a 2004 coronial inquest hearing there were 16 local persons of interest. Among those named was a man accused of pulling Ms. Patton's hair at the Leagues Club and another with whom she described sex as not rape. But not what I wanted. The inquest heard Ms. Patton had fought mightily for perhaps 15 minutes as she was bashed, slashed, and stabbed to death by sharp and blunt instruments. Ms. Patton's diary entries included references to one former island boyfriend, spitting on her, and later describing himself as her first enemy on Norfolk. About half the territory's population is descended from British sailors who mutinied against Naval Officer William Bligh on His Majesty's ship Bounty in 1789. The mutineers, led by Fletcher Christian, hid on Pitcairn Island with their Tahitian wives and their descendants, were resettled in 1856 on the former penal colony of Norfolk. Those real islanders form about a third of the permanent population. The Buffet, Quintal, Nobbs, Evans, McCoy, Adams, Young, and Christian families. They speak a mix of archaic English and Tahitian, but only among themselves, and the Norfolk phone book includes their nicknames in its listings. Early in the homicide investigation, Australian Federal Police fingerprinted most of the island's adults, but did not find a match for evidence found at the crime scene. In February 2006, 4 years after the discovery of Ms. Patton's body, 28-year-old father of 2 McDaniel was arrested in New Zealand. McDaniel had been questioned over a burglary shortly after Ms. Patton's murder, and his fingerprints were taken, along with a DNA sample, both of which were re-examined in 2004. 2 of the prints found on the plastic sheet used to wrap Ms. Patton's body belonged to McDaniel, and hairs matching her DNA were located in the boot of his Honda Civic. Broken pieces of green glass removed from Ms. Patton's hair were also similar to particles recovered from that vehicle. The only foreign DNA detected on Ms. Patton's body was from an unidentified female. McDaniel had arrived on Norfolk in 2000 with his girlfriend and worked at several island restaurants before returning to his homeland after Ms. Patton was killed. He initially claimed on the day Ms. Patton disappeared, he had been smoking cannabis and accidentally ran over her while driving his Civic. "I was just driving along the road and I dropped my smokes," McDaniel told detectives. "I bent down to pick them up and hit her. At first, I thought I'd hit a cow or a dog. I got out and saw that she was under the car and I panicked." McDaniel said he put Patton's body in the boot of his car, which he drove to Cockpit Waterfall Reserve, stabbing her only to make sure she was dead. He later retracted that statement, and in February 2007 faced trial in front of a jury drawn from fewer than 2,000 of the island's eligible voters. McDaniel gave evidence he did not kill Patton or see her on the day she was murdered, and claimed if he had made a confession, it was due to mental illness. Barrister Peter Garling, now a New South Wales Supreme Court judge, put forward the proposition Patton had been killed in a jealous rage by a woman. The jury found McDaniel guilty, and he was sentenced to 24 years in prison, with a minimum term that expires on February 1st. McDaniel, who has served his time in New South Wales jails, unsuccessfully appealed against his conviction to the federal court, and the High Court refused leave to appeal. 3 years after his conviction, the U.S. broadcaster NBC aired an episode of Dateline in which McNeil's girlfriend, Shelley Hooper, offered a fresh story about the murder. Ms. Hooper said Patton had been killed by a drug-dealing couple who forced McNeil to dispose of her body. McNeil later made the same claim from prison, adding he had been wearing surgical gloves, which he buried in his garden. Police searched McNeil's former property, but no gloves were found. Norfolk Island lawyer John Brown, who represented McNeil, stated there were quite a few inconsistencies in the case against his one-time client. One was that the only DNA found on the deceased person was female, Mr. Brown said. And there's no way he could have put female DNA on the deceased person. McNeil was expected to serve his parole in New Zealand after his likely release was confirmed by the Supreme Court of Norfolk Island. The modest semi-detached at 2 Blenheim Close in Mansfield, England, doesn't look like much. But until 2013, its back garden held a sinister secret. There, Susan Edwards had buried her parents after shooting them dead with her husband, Christopher. For 15 years, Susan and Christopher had kept their secret. Susan penned fake Christmas cards from her parents and told family members that the elderly couple had moved to Ireland. Meanwhile, she and her husband had pilfered a total of £285,286 from their savings and spent the money on celebrity memorabilia. And although the murderous couple might have gotten away with it, had it not been for their devotion to their collectibles, in the end, Susan and Christopher got tangled in their own elaborate web of lies. And now their shocking story has been turned into a British miniseries called Landscapers. Not much is known about Susan Edwards' early life. She was born around 1958 to William Wycherley, then 46, and his 23-year-old wife, Patricia, who was already pregnant when they married. Susan later claimed that she'd had an unhappy childhood. To the police, she said that William had abused her until she was 11. Patricia, Susan alleged, had stood silently by. As she got older, her grievances against her parents grew. In the 1970s, Susan's step-grandmother left her £10,000 that had once belonged to her maternal grandmother, and which Patricia claimed actually belonged to her. Although Susan tried to right the wrong, her mother saw by using the money to take her on a trip to America and help with the down payment on a new house. She later began to feel that her mother's ingratitude was tantamount to cheating her of the inheritance. Meanwhile, Susan's life went on. After briefly working as a librarian, Susan met her husband, Christopher, through a dating agency. They bonded over their love of memorabilia. Christopher liked military history, while Susan loved Hollywood's golden age celebrities, and they married in 1983. But as they shunned the outside world and spent Christopher's paycheck on collectible stamps and autographs, their financial difficulties mounted. They looked as though they needed money, one neighbor recalled. They dressed old-fashioned. They didn't have a car. They didn't even have a bike. One local shop owner remembered that Christopher always seemed concerned about what he spent. He was very careful with his money, she said. When you gave him the change, he'd count it penny by penny. He'd stand by the door and look at the receipt and check. According to police, Susan and Christopher figured that there was an easy way to get lots of money fast. With murder in mind, they drove to Susan's parents' house in the East Midlands for the May Day bank holiday in 1998. There, Christopher and Susan shot Susan's parents twice in the chest each, wrapped their bodies in a duvet, and buried them 3 feet underground in the back garden. The following Tuesday, when the banks reopened, Susan Edwards withdrew £40,000 from their account. But it was just the beginning. For 15 years, Susan and Christopher Edwards guarded their secret. As time passed, they made it seem like Patricia and William were still alive. I should explain that, with my father getting elderly and my mother not always in the best of health, They had been traveling around Ireland because of the good air on and off for some years, Susan wrote to a relative in 2007. On another occasion, in 2011, Susan raved that her parents were enjoying a second youth and wrote, "It is good to see them with such zest." All the while, Susan and Christopher were siphoning money from William and Patricia's accounts. They set up loans and credit cards under the dead couple's name, fake pension and disability benefits, documents, and even sold their house with a forged signature. Meanwhile, the bodies of William and Patricia Wycherley still lay underground and undetected. The money they stole didn't go into savings or real estate, however. Instead, Susan and Christopher squandered thousands of pounds on celebrity memorabilia. Once, they spent £14,000 on Gary Cooper collectibles. Another time, they dropped £20,000 on a collection of autographs. But by 2012, they started to get nervous. That year, William Wycherley was turning 100, and the Department for Work and Pensions asked for a face-to-face interview to mark the occasion. Buckingham Palace had also written inquiring where to send a telegram to congratulate the man on reaching his centennial birthday. Susan and Christopher panicked and fled to Lille, France, with their most valuable film memorabilia. However, they quickly discovered that they couldn't access the Wycherleys' bank accounts from abroad. But they refused to sell anything they'd brought with them. So, as money started running out, Christopher called his stepmother to get more. His elaborate lie would instead blow the case wide open. In 2013, Elizabeth Edwards received a strange call from her stepson, Christopher. He needed money, he said, and then he told her a shocking story. According to Christopher, his wife Susan had been sleeping at her parents' place in May 1998 when she heard a bang during the night. When Susan went to investigate, she found that her mother, Patricia, had shot and killed her father, William. From there, Christopher said, things had escalated. Patricia had mocked Susan and said that she'd slept with Christopher in 1992. Then Susan shot her mother, but Christopher didn't want to throw her to the wolves by going to the police. Susan Edwards, who repeated this story at her trial, offered even more details. Claiming that she'd hidden her crime from Christopher for a week, she said that her mother had provoked her. "My mother said I was an unwanted child. She wanted an abortion. They both wanted an abortion," Susan Edwards told the court. "She told me she knew that my father abused me. At some point, she threw the gun on the bed. I picked it up. She kept going on, and I asked her to stop saying these things. I asked her, 'Please stop saying these things. Will you go away?' She didn't. She kept on and on. To make her stop talking," Susan said, she shot her mother in the chest. But Elizabeth was unswayed by her stepson's story. She called the police and told him exactly what he'd said. When we received that call on October 1st, it was difficult to believe that what she said had happened could have happened, admitted Detective Chief Inspector Rob Griffin. But we took it seriously, and that is when the investigation started. The police began to dig up the garden at 2 Blenheim Close. Then, on October 9th, 2013, they found the remains of William and Patricia Wycherley. Penniless and backed into a corner, Christopher and Susan Edwards turned themselves in soon afterward. Later on today, we are going to surrender ourselves to the UK Border Force authorities at the Eurostar terminal at Lille Europe Station, Christopher wrote in an email to the police on October 30th. We would prefer to do this since my wife is already sufficiently frightened. Please, could you notify the UK Border Force at Lille Europe so that they may expect us? The police didn't buy Christopher and Susan Edwards' story. To them, the murder of William and Patricia Wycherley looked more like a calculated kill than a crime of passion. For one thing, both victims had been carefully shot twice in the torso. For another, their daughter had immediately withdrawn thousands from their bank account. And, of course, Susan and Christopher had covered up what they did for 15 years. Police suspect that it was Christopher, urged on by Susan, who pulled the trigger. After all, He admitted to having experience with guns and had even been part of a shooting club. This is a couple that appear to have planned for some years to exact revenge for the taking of inheritance that had been due to Susan from her step-grandmother. Detective Rob Griffin explained. They had spent a number of years planning how they might get some of that money back, and they decided on a course of action. They said, "We will travel to Mansfield. We will kill this couple, who we know will not be missed, and take all of their money." He added, "I would describe that as pretty cold and calculating." In 2014, both Susan and Christopher Edwards were found guilty. They were each sentenced to at least 25 years in prison for the double murder. It was through good old-fashioned detective work that we were able to separate fact from fiction, said Griffin. The Edwards were their own worst enemies in the end. It was in the finer detail of their own story that we were able to expose their lies. Netflix has gained quite the reputation for true crime documentaries. One of these documentaries is called Girl in the Picture, which talks about the absurd and gruesome tale of Sharon Marshall, who was abducted as a child by her own stepfather, Franklin Delano Floyd. One stormy night in April 1990 in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, 3 men were making their way to a motel when they spotted a shoe in the middle of the road. 200 feet further, the men made a startling discovery. On the edge of the road was a young woman lying face down in the gutter. She was taken to a hospital and died days later of her injuries. She had many aliases: Tanya Hughes, Sharon Marshall, but her real name is Suzanne Sevakis. Suzanne Sevakis was abducted as a child by Frank Floyd and raised as his daughter. He sexually abused her and forced her to marry him, and then she was killed in what Floyd claims was a hit-and-run accident in 1990. She was just 20 years old at the time of her death. Suzanne Marie Sevakis was born on September 6, 1969 in Michigan. Her mother, Sandra Willett, says she was struggling with PTSD after a tornado had hit the trailer where she lived with her children when she met Floyd. He had pledged to take care of her and her children, but had started to do scary things, such as carrying a knife with him at all times and telling Willett, "You think you're gonna leave me? That's not happening." One day, Willett needed to buy diapers for her children and wrote a bad check at a convenience store. She was sentenced to 30 days in jail. "That's when he took my children," Willett said. She says that when she went to the police, the officers asked if she was legally married to Floyd, and when she answered affirmatively, she was told she would have to handle the situation herself. While Willett was serving her jail sentence in 1974, Floyd dropped off 2 of Willett's daughters at an orphanage and left with Suzanne. She wouldn't be known as Suzanne again for another 40 years. It was during the investigation into Suzanne's son, Michael's kidnapping, that authorities learned his real name was Franklin Floyd, and that he previously abducted a girl, robbed a bank, and attacked a woman. By the time authorities connected the dots, he had been on the run for 2 decades after failing to appear in court. Joe Fitzpatrick, an FBI special agent who worked on the case, says in Girl in the Picture, "Through news coverage of Michael's kidnapping, a woman named Jenny Fisher got wind that authorities were circulating images of Tanya, saying she had recently died and of her young son who was missing. Fisher was confused. The woman identified on television as Tanya was her former high school best friend, whom she knew as Sharon Marshall. Sharon, as Suzanne was known to her high school friends, is remembered in Girl in the Picture as a brilliant, ambitious student who had been accepted to Georgia Tech and dreamed of being an aerospace engineer. Sharon's friends knew her father to be a strange man who kept a close eye on his daughter and seemed at times inappropriate with her. The man was Floyd, who had represented himself as Suzanne's dad, and called himself Warren Marshall. When authorities told Fisher years later that the man was her friend's husband, she was shocked. "They said they're married, and I'm like, no, that's her father. They're not married. Fisher says in the documentary. And they said, no, honey, they're married. And I was like, no, that was her father. We had a portrait of very different people when it came to who Sharon was. In 1989, 1 year before Suzanne's death, they changed their names. Fitzpatrick explains in Girl in the picture. Sharon Marshall became Tanya, and Warren Marshall became Clarence Hughes. The names they used were taken off tombstones in Alabama, and then they got married under their new names in New Orleans, which means this man married his own daughter. It was unbelievable. In the time between high school and her death, Suzanne was sexually abused by Floyd. Fisher shares a harrowing account of him raping Suzanne at gunpoint one night when Fisher was sleeping over, Floyd having threatened both girls with a weapon and forced to perform sex work. Heather Lane, a former dancer at Mons Venus, a club in Tampa, Florida that provided adult entertainment, remembers the woman she knew as Sharon as a very shy person who didn't really talk about her past and didn't talk about herself. She recounts hearing about Sharon's dad and their weird relationship. According to Lane, Sharon's dad had told her to inquire about the parties being organized at the club and to make herself available for them. One night, during an event that was supposed to involve no lap dancing and no contact between patrons and dancers, Lane says she was alerted to the fact that Sharon was in front of the women's bathroom, offering sex services to these men for $50. She said, "Well, my dad told me to do it, and he bought me condoms," Lane says. That was disgusting. I couldn't believe that a man would put his daughter in that situation. Soon, it became apparent that Sharon was pregnant. It was around that time that she gave birth to Michael. Sharon's relationship with her son, Michael, was beautiful, Lane says. She was a wonderful mother. She was so engaged with him. And just seeing the way he looked at her, I think that was the best thing that ever happened to her. In 1995, Floyd was found guilty by a judge of having abducted Michael Hughes and handed a prison sentence. That investigation turned up photos of Cheryl Ann Comso, a friend of Sharon's who had also worked at Mons Venus. Comesso's remains were found in 1995, and she was later determined to have died in 1989. Fitzpatrick contends in Girl in the picture that Floyd left Florida and married Suzanne in an attempt to evade authorities after murdering Cheryl Ann. In 1997, Floyd was charged with first-degree murder in Comesso's death. He was convicted and sentenced to death 5 years later, in 2002. Floyd remains in custody at the Union Correctional Institution in Rayford, Florida. People kept trying to figure out who Sharon Marshall really was, and what had happened to Michael after his abduction. It wasn't until 2014 that Floyd answered both questions during a conversation with FBI agents in prison. According to FBI Special Agent Scott Lobb, Floyd, during a contentious exchange, told him he had killed the boy after the kidnapping. Floyd also revealed to the FBI Sharon Marshall's real name, identifying her as Suzanne Sevakis. The FBI still considers Suzanne's death as suspicious and unsolved. That's the one thing Floyd won't talk about, Lobb stated. Authorities believe Franklin killed Sharon because she tried to leave him and run away with a college student named Kevin Brown. But her stepdad-turned-husband has never admitted to her murder. He did, however, admit to the FBI that he shot her young son Michael in the head and killed him on the same day he kidnapped the little boy from his school. He said he disposed of the boy's remains on Interstate 35, though no trace was ever found. Police believe his body may have been eaten by wild hogs. Suzanne's parents, Sandra Willett and Clifford Sevakis, are both still alive. They were both informed of what happened to their daughter after the discovery was made, and they both share their stories in Girl in the picture. Their narratives highlight what made the family vulnerable to Floyd. Willett, a divorced mother struggling with PTSD following the tornado, who tried in vain to get help from social services when she became unable to care for her children, and Clifford Sevakis, a young Vietnam veteran still kind of messed up from the war, who didn't feel any more able to be a parent. Suzanne became pregnant 3 times in her lifetime. One of her children was Michael Hughes, and another was Megan Dufresne, Suzanne's biological daughter, placed for adoption in 1989. Dufresne explains in the documentary that learning her birth mother's story has left her feeling a strange kind of anger, which she's still trying to process. No girl should have to go through that, she says. From a stranger, much less somebody's that's supposed to be her father figure, whatever the hell he was. Dufresne has named her own son Michael after her late brother. In 2017, Suzanne's tombstone, which until then had always read Tanya, was changed to reflect her true identity. Fisher, Dufresne, and Dufresne's grandfather, Clifford Sevakis, are all seen together in Girl in the Picture for the unveiling of the new gravestone, which identifies her as Suzanne Marie Sevakis. Arlene Fraser, a 33-year-old mother of 2, from Elgin, Scotland, disappeared in late April 1998. The authorities have never discovered her remains to date, though one perpetrator was brought to justice after almost a decade of legal wrangling in courts of 2 different countries. Arlene Fraser was born in Elgin, Scotland, in 1965. The 33-year-old mother vanished hours after waving her children Natalie, then 11, and Jamie, then 6, off to school on April 28, 1998. Her contact lenses, watches, rings, and medicine to treat her Crohn's disease were left behind in her home, and there were no signs of any struggle. There have been no reported sightings, and her bank account showed no activities. However, the authorities believed she was dead after leading a futile search for her for around 6 months. Detective Chief Inspector Peter Simpson said in late October 1998 that Grampian police had found no evidence that the mother of 2 was still alive. "I believe that she's dead. There's no indication that she's living somewhere else." Arlene's family also agreed with the detective's assessment, with her sister, Carol Gillies, alleging, "I feel a sense of loss. I feel Arlene is dead. I feel something has happened to Arlene that is beyond Arlene's control. Arlene wouldn't put us through all this." Her remains have not been discovered to date. Arlene was reported missing on the evening of April 28th, and her father, Hector McInnes, other relatives, police officers, and community members searched the countryside around Elgin in northeast Scotland. The law enforcement also conducted a fruitless search of the area, using helicopters from nearby Rafe Lossiemouth, mountain rescue teams, search dogs, and police divers. Her mother, Isabel Thompson, emotionally appealed for her daughter to make contact, while the authorities announced a £20,000 reward for information. After an inquiry that cost £250,000 and included interviews with over 1,000 people, Grampian Police Detective Simpson said, "The only conclusion that's still left open to us, which I firmly believe has happened, is that something criminal has taken place here, and that Arlene has been the victim of a crime." Then, her estranged husband, Nat, was considered a person of interest after reports indicated he'd physically abused his wife after she arrived home from a night out with friends in March 1998. In a chilling prophecy, Fraser told her weeks before she vanished, "If you are not going to live with me, you will not be living with anyone." Around the time she went missing, Fraser was spotted pacing around and his hands were shaking. As the days wore on in the search for her, the family were frantically hoping for information, but Fraser seemed calm, collected, not fussed. Within days, he was back to his normal self and made bad taste remarks, including one incident when he held up a toy mustache and joked it was the disguise the missing woman used to run away. He also told her father that the children would soon forget their mother when nobody else knew she was dead. A former police officer said the inaction shown by Fraser when his wife was missing was unique in his 40 years with the force. Advocate Deputy Ruth Anderson Queen's counsel stated, "Nat grabbed Arlene and compressed her neck. As a result of that, she fell to the floor of the bathroom." Reports further claimed she later told her friends she might have lost consciousness because of the attack, and her family doctor found bruising on her left shoulder, upper chest, left arm, and back. After observing substantial bruising on her neck and hemorrhaging on her eyelids, telltale signs of strangling, Arlene reported the incident to the police. Nat was arrested for attempted murder and was out on bail when Arlene disappeared. However, the investigators stated they were satisfied with his account of his whereabouts on April 28th. He had even joined the search for his estranged wife and said, "I still live in hope that someday she'll turn up." In February 2000, Nat, then 41, admitted a reduced charge of assault after the prosecution agreed to drop the attempted murder charges, much to her family's disappointment, and received a 2-year sentence, but was released in December 1998. Meanwhile, Nat and his friend, Moray farmer Hector Dick, were charged with attempting to pervert the course of justice over their alleged knowledge of a car, a beige Ford Fiesta, bought on the eve of Arlene's disappearance. The prosecution alleged Hector had been recorded discussing the missing car with Kevin Ritchie, who allegedly sold him the vehicle. Hector told the police the Ford Fiesta had been crushed at an Elgin scrapyard. He pled guilty to a slightly lesser charge and tried to hang himself during his 1-year sentence. In June 2001, Glenn Lucas faced charges for attempting to pervert the course of justice in the case. On April 26, 2002, the Crown Office indicted Nat, Glenn, and Hector for Arlene's murder. The charges included conspiracy to murder, actual murder, and obstructing justice. Reports stated a forensic lip-reading expert analyzed prison CCTV footage to ascertain Nat had allegedly made incriminating statements to a visitor. The controversial analysis resulted in him being charged with his wife's murder. Before the January 2003 trial, the prosecution dropped the charges against Glenn and Hector, with the latter becoming a witness against Nat. He later admitted to destroying a car linked to her disappearance, but denied further involvement. As the trial continued, Nat's defense focused on his alibi of working for his fruit and vegetable business during his wife's disappearance. However, he was found guilty of murder, despite the police never recovering her body, on January 29, 2003, and sentenced to life with a minimum of 25 years. The Court of Appeal granted permission for Nat's December 2003 appeal in May 2004. An October 2005 documentary suggested Hector had lied during the trial, prompting inquiries into the evidence available and its handling. Nat was released from prison in May 2006 during his appeal. However, fresh allegations surfaced, causing controversy. The appeal process continued with claims of evidence withholding and police deception. The Supreme Court eventually refused his plea in May 2008, prompting Nat to seek leave to appeal at the Privy Council, which was also denied. A November 2009 further appeal contended unfairness under human rights legislation was also rejected in January 2010. However, Nat won his appeal in the Supreme Court in London in May 2011. The London Apex Court remitted the case for consideration of a new prosecution. Nat faced his second trial in the Edinburgh High Court in 2012. The judge soon stated the evidence pointed toward Nat's orchestration of his wife's premeditated murder and disposal of her body. He was thus again found guilty in May 2012, with the verdict attributing him to Arlene's murder and handing him a minimum sentence of 17 years. Then, in 2018, he had 6 months added to his term after being caught with a cell phone in prison. Therefore, he, now in his mid-60s, is incarcerated in Low Moss Prison. All the while, his supporters continue to maintain his innocence. In the early hours of June 26, 2011, Stephen McDaniel broke into the apartment of his neighbor and fellow Mercer University Law School graduate Lauren Giddings, then murdered her and dismembered her body. On June 29th, Giddings' family and friends reported her missing. When local news media in Macon, Georgia heard about her disappearance, they sent a camera crew to her apartment complex. There, on June 30th, reporters from the television station WGXA conducted an interview with McDaniel. During the interview, McDaniel posed as a concerned neighbor. He described Giddings as nice as can be and very personable. But shortly into the interview, McDaniel's behavior took a dramatic turn. After he learned from the reporter that a body had been found, his worry turned to utter panic. "Body?" he said, visibly anxious. "I think I need to sit down."
I was living there?
Yeah, Lauren was my neighbor. We're just trying to find out where she is at this point. I mean, no one has seen her since Saturday. I mean, the last time anyone heard from her was an email that she sent out, and no one's heard from her since.
Did you see her hang out with anyone at the time, anything like that?
I mean, no one has seen her since Saturday. I haven't seen anything. I mean, you always hear noise outside, but it's just people walking by pretty much.
And she just recently graduated from Mercer?
Yeah, she and I were both JD students. We graduated back in May.
What kind of person was she? I mean, what did you see her?
I mean, she's as nice as can be. I mean, very personable, very much a people person.
Do you know any enemies she might have had, somebody that might want to hurt her?
No, we don't know where she is. I mean, the only thing we can think is that maybe she went out running and someone snatched her. Because we went over. One of her friends had a key. We went inside and tried to see if there was anything amiss, but I mean, she had a door jamb that was sitting right by it, so there was no sign that anyone broke in. I mean, the door was locked when everyone got here. I mean, we just don't know where she is.
What about in the parking lot area? I know they've been doing a lot of. I think that's where they have recovered the body or whatever they recovered from there.
Body.
Had you seen anything there? Had you seen anything there? I mean, we don't know if this is the same person. You know what I mean? Like, they took out a body there earlier. We don't know if it's the same person or not. So that's how we're trying to ask people if they know who lived there. Are you okay, sir?
I think I need to sit down.
Okay.
Though some may have initially thought that McDaniel's reaction was merely the shock of losing a friend, police named him as a person of interest in the investigation just one day later. And it was later revealed that McDaniel was indeed the one who had killed Giddings and butchered her body. Given the nature of the crime, the brutality of it, and how little contact McDaniel had with Giddings prior to the murder, many believe that had he not been caught, he would have gone on to kill even more women. Stephen McDaniel was born on September 9, 1985, and grew up near Atlanta, Georgia. His early life was unremarkable, but as a young man, he was academically inclined enough to graduate from Mercer University's law school. His future victim, Lauren Giddings, was another graduate. By 2011, both 25-year-old McDaniel and 27-year-old Giddings lived in the same apartment complex, a short distance from the school's campus. At the time, Giddings was preparing to take the bar exam and then start a promising career as a defense attorney. But tragically, while Giddings had been preparing for the bar, McDaniel had been preparing for her murder. At first glance, McDaniel didn't seem like he had it in him to commit such a heinous crime. As the Macon Telegraph reported, it didn't even seem like he was staying in town for much longer. The lease on his apartment was up in 2 weeks, and he reportedly planned on moving back in with his parents. But as police would later discover, McDaniel had been posting on the internet about his hatred of women and his desire to torture them. Oddly enough, he was also something of a survivalist, stockpiling food and energy drinks in his apartment. And as he told police during an interrogation, he often wore the same pair of underwear for more than one day at a time. McDaniel didn't have much luck when it came to women. He was on eHarmony, but he didn't land many dates. He was also a self-professed virgin, claiming that he was saving himself for marriage, and yet he had condoms in his apartment, a fact that would later prove to be very important in the investigation of Lauren Giddings' murder. That said, McDaniel caught the attention of the authorities shortly after the investigation began. Shortly after Giddings' dismembered torso was found in a trash can near her apartment complex, McDaniel and Giddings' other neighbors had been taken to the police station to give statements about the young woman's disappearance. At the time, none of them knew that her remains had been found. Each neighbor agreed to have their apartment searched, except McDaniel. "It's the lawyer in me," he said. "I'm just always protective of my space." He eventually allowed one detective to walk through his unit, but only if McDaniel was there at the same time. Given the damning evidence that police would later find in his apartment, it's not surprising that he would want to keep them out. After all, he had Giddings' underwear in there, and a stolen master key that he had used to break into her apartment. As Stephen McDaniel stood by while police searched the apartment complex for clues, a local television news station called WGXA sent a crew to the building to report on the story. When they spotted McDaniel standing around, they asked if he would give an interview, and he agreed. At first, McDaniel seemed like any other concerned local who was worried about his missing neighbor. "We don't know where she is," he told the reporter behind the camera. "The only thing we can think of is that maybe she went out running and someone snatched her. One of her friends had a key. We went inside and tried to see anything that was amiss. She had a door jamb that was sitting right by it, so there was no sign that anyone broke in." But by the time McDaniel learned from the reporter that a body had been discovered in a nearby trash can, his demeanor completely changed. Visibly panicked, he was silent for a moment before telling the reporter that he needed to sit down. It was later revealed that only Giddings' torso had been found, and the other parts of her body had been discarded elsewhere. As McDaniel failed to maintain his composure, police learned more about their person of interest and the disturbing details of his personal life. Authorities would eventually uncover evidence from McDaniel's laptop that showed he'd been gathering information on Giddings and her whereabouts leading up to her death. There was also a series of videos that indicated he'd been stalking Giddings, looking into her apartment unit through a window. The case took a turn for the worse for McDaniel when the computer evidence started coming out, and it just kept coming. McDaniel's attorney, Frank Hogue, later explained that they were continuing to find more and more evidence related to his computer and camera. The fact that McDaniel had posted on a number of internet blogs and forums about his general hatred of women and his desire to hurt them only strengthened the case for his involvement in the horrific murder. But even before police had collected this information, they felt certain they'd found their man based on their initial conversations with him. So, on the same day they discovered Giddings' body, they brought McDaniel into the police station for another round of questioning. Less than 12 hours later, when Stephen McDaniel was brought into the police station again on the night of June 30th, 2011, his demeanor was eerily still. He was also tight-lipped, only answering a few questions, most often responding, "I don't know." Even when detectives were out of the room, McDaniel sat perfectly still. The interview stretched on into the early hours of July 1st, and McDaniel still had nothing to say. Detective David Patterson grilled McDaniel for hours, asking about Lauren Giddings' location, asserting that he knew McDaniel knew what had happened. He also acknowledged McDaniel's shift in demeanor from how willing he'd been to talk earlier in the day on June 30th. Eventually, Detective David Patterson left the interrogation room and Detective Scott Chapman entered. After another series of questions and no real answers, Chapman attempted to appeal to McDaniel's humanity. "We want to give you the opportunity to tell it," he said. "So you don't look like a monster at the end. I know you feel bad about it." Though the gravity of the situation was clearly weighing on McDaniel, he still refused to share any meaningful information with Chapman. It was only when Detective Carl Fletcher entered the room that McDaniel slipped up. McDaniel didn't admit to murdering Giddings that night, but he did admit to an unrelated crime. At one point during the interrogation, Fletcher mentioned condoms that had been found in McDaniel's apartment. Since McDaniel was supposedly a virgin who was saving himself for marriage, why did he have condoms? And where did he get them? As McDaniel put it, he had previously entered a few of his classmates' apartments while they were out and taken condoms from them. In other words, he confessed to burglarizing his classmates' residences. Because of this, he was arrested on burglary charges as police gathered all the evidence they needed to prove his involvement in Lauren Giddings' murder. In 2014, McDaniel pleaded guilty to murdering Giddings. He admitted to breaking into her apartment using a stolen master key, strangling her to death, and dismembering her body with a hacksaw in the bathtub. After his guilty plea, he was sentenced to life in prison for the grisly crime. Since then, Stephen McDaniel has attempted to appeal his conviction on numerous occasions, making allegations about ineffective counsel and the theft of defense trial preparations by the state. So far, he has failed with all of his appeals. And though he will be eligible for parole in 2041, legal experts strongly believe that he will spend the rest of his life behind bars. The case of Gabriel Fernandez was far from a secret to teachers and social workers. Though some adults attempted to help him, they didn't do enough. And Gabriel Fernandez was tragically murdered at the age of 8. Since then, Gabriel's case has provoked anger and repulsion. How did his case go uninvestigated for so long? What more could the adults in his life have done to save the vulnerable California boy? And how can social workers make sure that what happened to Gabriel never happens again? This is the story of Gabriel Fernandez and the horrific mistreatment he openly suffered at the hands of his caregivers before he died in May 2013. Born on February 20th, 2005, in Palmdale, California, Gabriel Fernandez had a difficult family life from the start. His mother, Pearl Fernandez, didn't want another child and even left him at the hospital. In fact, Pearl already had a record of child neglect. 1 year earlier, reports stated that a relative had notified Child Protective Services, saying that Pearl was mistreating another son. But nothing was done. Unwanted by his mother, Gabriel spent much of his life with his great-uncle and his partner. He then later moved in with his grandparents. But in 2012, although Pearl had faced accusations of mistreating her daughter and neglecting to feed her, Pearl suddenly insisted that Gabriel wasn't being properly cared for by his relatives and that she wanted him back. Pearl actually took Gabriel back because she wanted to collect welfare benefits. Despite the objections of Gabriel's grandparents, she brought the boy back into her house in October 2012. There, Gabriel lived with his mother, her boyfriend Isoro Aguirre, and 2 older siblings, 11-year-old Ezekiel and 9-year-old Virginia. Soon afterward, Jennifer Garcia, Gabriel's first-grade teacher at Summerwind Elementary in Palmdale, California, started to notice that the boy showed signs of being mistreated. In fact, Gabriel even told her about it. "Is it normal for moms to hit their kids?" he asked Garcia one day in October 2012. After school that day, Garcia called a child abuse hotline, which put her in touch with a caseworker named Stephanie Rodriguez. Although Garcia initially felt reassured, the abuse of Gabriel Fernandez seemed to continue. One day, he came to class with chunks of his hair missing. Another day, Gabriel Fernandez appeared with an injured lip. Garcia continually reached out to Rodriguez, but the caseworker said that she couldn't discuss the details of Gabriel's case. Rodriguez had, in fact, visited the Fernandez home, but Gabriel often recanted his stories, and Rodriguez noted that the children at the residence seemed appropriately dressed, visibly healthy, and did not have any marks or bruises. Sadly, his case was actually much worse than Rodriguez, or even Garcia, seemed to realize. And in May 2013, Gabriel Fernandez's mom and her boyfriend would badly mistreat the 8-year-old. On May 22, 2013, Pearl Fernandez called 911 to report that her son, Gabriel, was not breathing. Paramedics arrived and found the boy with broken ribs, a fractured skull, missing teeth, and wounds on his body. "I tried to feel his heart," Pearl Fernandez's boyfriend Isaacson Aguirre said, placing the blame for Gabriel's injuries on roughhousing with his older brother. "And nothing is moving." It later came out that Pearl and Isaacson had tortured him. Gabriel Fernandez died 2 days later of his injuries on May 24, 2013. And then, in the months following, the shocking depth of his mistreatment and the homophobic motives of his tormentors came to light. The mistreatment happened over the course of 8 months. Sometimes they locked him in a cabinet they called the cubby. They called him gay, possibly because he had previously been raised by a gay great-uncle, punished him whenever they saw him playing with dolls. But despite the many warning signs, he was tragically never rescued. In the aftermath of Gabriel Fernandez's death, both Pearl Fernandez and Isaacson Aguirre were arrested and charged with the boy's murder. Pearl pled guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. "I want to say I'm sorry to my family for what I did," Pearl Fernandez said in court in 2018, according to the Los Angeles Times. "I wish Gabriel was alive. Every day, I wish that I'd made better choices. I'm sorry to my children, and I want them to know that I love them." The judge, however, didn't mince words. He said that Gabriel's death had been so horrific that he'd almost call it animalistic, except animals know how to take care of their young. Aguirre was also found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to death. Currently, however, California has suspended all capital punishment, so Aguirre remains in prison for the foreseeable future. But they weren't the only people to face consequences for Gabriel Fernandez's death. 4 social workers, Stephanie Rodriguez, Patricia Clement, Kevin Baum, and Gregory Merritt, faced charges of falsifying public records. However, reports stated that an appellate panel in January 2020 decided that they should not face criminal charges. Now, Gabriel Fernandez's loved ones can only hope that his horrific death wasn't entirely in vain. Though he had clearly slipped through the cracks of the Los Angeles Department of Child and Family Services, the department vowed to begin a new era of reform after his murder. Reports state that the organization added new policies to ensure child safety, hired more than 3,000 new social workers since 2013 to lighten caseloads, and retrained current caseworkers on how to effectively interview witnesses and notice physical signs of abuse before it's too late. Will it be enough? According to reports, several mistreated children in the Los Angeles area and elsewhere were killed in the years following Gabriel Fernandez's death. As such, there's clearly more work to be done. Tragically, Gabriel Fernandez's death was entirely preventable. After his teacher notified social workers of the abuse, something could have been done. Instead, the little boy was left to suffer and die at the hands of his own caregivers, as the city of Los Angeles turned a blind eye. On the night of January 6, 2007, Channon Christian, 21, and her boyfriend Christopher Newsom, 23, headed out for a friend's birthday party in Knoxville, Tennessee. They never arrived. En route to the festivities, they were carjacked, tortured, raped, and killed in acts of unthinkable violence. Dina Christian, Shannon's mother, awoke with a bad feeling on January 7th. Channon, a sociology major at the University of Tennessee, wasn't home or answering phone calls. The worry intensified when Shannon's best friend called and said that the two were no-shows at the party. Then Shannon's boss phoned to say she never came to work. Dina dialed 911. Because Channon and Chris were adults, authorities couldn't step in until after 24 hours had passed. In the meantime, Shannon's cell phone pinged near Cherry Street, a high-crime neighborhood in the city. It's not an area you go to unless you live there or unless you're up to no good, Knoxville News Sentinel reporter Jamie Satterfield stated. The Christians and Newsoms went searching for their kids on their own, and Shannon's father found her car. Ed Kingsbury, an investigator with the Knoxville Police Department, stated that the vehicle had been wiped down and the scrubbing was an ominous red flag. The situation went from bad to worse. On January 8th, a man's burned body, still smoking in the aftermath of being set ablaze, was found near train tracks. Authorities confirmed that it was Chris Newsom. He had been bound and shot 3 times and set on fire. To locate Channon, police examined her car and found an envelope. It was dusted for prints and yielded a hit. Tim Hutchison, a retired Knox County sheriff, stated, "The suspect, Lamarcus Davidson, was a known carjacker who'd recently gotten out of prison. Investigators learned that he was renting a small house on Chipman Street in the Cherry Street area. On January 9th, investigators searched the house and found Shannon's lifeless body. She had been gang raped, choked, and bound before being put in a garbage can and suffocated to death. They stuffed her in a trash can like a piece of trash," Dina Christian stated. A search of the murder scene turned up a video rented from a library in Kentucky by a man named George Thomas. As the investigation crossed state lines and federal investigators were called in, Knoxville police questioned Davidson's girlfriend, Daphne Sutton, who'd lived in the Chipman Street house right up until Channon and Chris went missing. Sutton told authorities that on January 7th, Davidson was at the house with Thomas, Davidson's half-brother Latalvis Cobbins, and a woman named Vanessa Kolman. Sutton said she'd last seen Davidson when she dropped him off later that day at the home of a person named Eric Boyd. Knoxville police tracked down Boyd, who led them to a house where Davidson was holed up. As the SWAT team grabbed Davidson, the suspect declared that he'd done nothing to that girl. Meanwhile, about 133 miles away in Lebanon, Kentucky, Cobbins, Kolman, and Thomas were arrested. Authorities counted on the alleged co-conspirators to rat each other out, and Thomas revealed that Davidson was the ringleader of the murders and named Boyd as his accomplice. Authorities had 5 suspects in custody and mounting DNA material incriminating suspects in varying ways to Shannon's killing, despite the fact household clean had been poured in her mouth to remove evidence, according to court records. On the other hand, DNA evidence on Chris was destroyed when his body was set ablaze. Aware that there was evidence, the 5 suspects told their version of the events to cast blame on others. A picture of the fatal events emerged. Davidson needed a vehicle, and Channon and Christopher were targeted for carjacking. When the 2 were ambushed at gunpoint, another car approached and spooked the suspects. The couple was pushed into the vehicle and taken to the Chipman Street house. A key element of the case turned on Tennessee's criminal responsibility law. If you're aware of a crime and do nothing to stop it, you're held responsible too. Except for Boyd, suspects implicated themselves by admitting that they were in the house. Among the questions that emerged was whether Kolman was a willing participant in the crime or held against her will. In a journal, Kolman described events around January 7th as fun adventures. It cast doubts on her claims of innocence. Trials unfolded separately. In April 2008, Boyd was found guilty of being an accessory to a fatal carjacking and of aiding Davidson, a fugitive. He was sentenced to the maximum of 18 years. The Knox County DA built sturdy cases against Davidson, Cobbins, and Thomas. Over 8 months, each was tried independently on 46 charges, including the kidnap, rape, and murder of Channon and Chris. This was the worst crime Knoxville had experienced, Hugh Newsom stated. Photographs of the crimes caused some people in court to pass out. The judge, former Knox County Criminal Court, Judge Richard Baumgartner, declared that anyone who cried would be kicked out of court. "You will not be allowed to be in this courtroom if you do that because I will not tolerate it," Baumgartner said in taped proceedings. The verdicts were delivered in 3 independent trials before 3 separate 12-member juries. Davidson was found guilty of 2 premeditated murders and received the death penalty. Thomas and Cobbins each got life sentences without the possibility of parole. Kolman was found guilty of lesser charges and was sentenced to 53 years. But a shocking twist that threw judgments into question came 4 years after the murders. In January 2011, Baumgartner announced that he was stepping down and admitted that he was hooked on opiates. The disgraced judge resigned and eventually pleaded to misconduct before he died at age 70 in 2018. The state Supreme Court ruled that because there was DNA evidence in the Davidson and Cobbins convictions, the sentences would stand, but new trials for Thomas and Kolman were ordered. In November 2012, Kolman was found guilty of facilitating a deadly carjack and kidnap. Her sentence was reduced from 53 years to 35 years. 6 months later, Thomas's sentence was reduced to life with the possibility of parole after 51 years. Relieved that perpetrators didn't get away scot-free, the Newsoms were still determined that Boyd would pay for their son's death. "We took it upon ourselves to go and talk to George Thomas," Hugh Newsom stated. Prosecutors struck a deal with him if Thomas testified against Boyd. 11 years after the murders, Thomas threw everything on Boyd, Satterfield stated. On August 13, 2018, Boyd was found guilty of 36 charges connected to the kidnap, rape, and murder of Channon and Chris. He received 2 life sentences plus 90 years in prison. Davidson and Boyd have unsuccessfully appealed their sentences. The Christians and the Newsoms are present for every appeal. Seeking justice for their kids never ends. Janet Levine March had a seemingly perfect life at the time she disappeared in August 1996. Married to a successful lawyer, this mother of 2 had a flourishing art career and lived in a dream home she had designed and built. Arthur March and his son Perry are 2 Americans who have escaped to the central Mexican town of Ajayac. Years ago, Arthur March became one of hundreds of American retirees who settled in the little lakeside town. But his son Perry was a successful Nashville attorney in the prime of his career. Why did he come down to Ajayac? "I brought Perry down here because he didn't have any other place to go," says Arthur March. On a summer night in 1996, Perry March's wife, Janet Levine March, mysteriously disappeared without a trace. And ever since, Perry March says he has become a target too, pursued by people he says are determined to destroy him. About a month and a half ago, there was an effort afoot to either have me killed or have me arrested, to plant something like cocaine in my car, says Perry. And, he says, these same people are trying to kidnap his 2 children, Sammy and Zeepy. Janet's disappearance still mystifies her family and close friends. Her father, Larry Levine, says Janet's plans included kids, marriage, a family, a home, an art career, her mother Carolyn adds. The Levines had proudly watched their daughter fulfill those plans, one by one. Janet returned to Nashville with her college boyfriend, Perry March, in 1985. They married in 1987 and lived in a house just a few miles from her parents. "I cared about him a lot, an awful lot," Carolyn Levine now says about Perry. She became almost a surrogate mother to Perry. His own mother had died in an accident when he was only 9 years old. Janet loved him, and as long as she did. "Then we wanted to do everything we could to help him," Larry Levine recalls. And Janet's parents did help him. Larry Levine paid Perry's way through Vanderbilt Law School in Nashville. Then Perry began practicing law and ended up working in his father-in-law's firm. "He treated me as a confidant and as a son," says Perry. Meanwhile, Janet pursued her art. She had done some really fine work, sold some paintings, and had been hired to do some commercial illustrations, says Perry. 3 years after they married, Sammy was born. Then, 4 years later, Janet gave birth to their daughter Zipporah, known as Zippy. And in 1995, Perry says Janet fulfilled yet another of her dreams, building a spectacular home she had designed. This was her dream home, he says. On the surface, Janet had it all, a dream house. 2 beautiful children, an art career, and a successful husband. But something must have gone terribly wrong, because around 8 p.m. on August 15th, 1996, Perry March says she just walked out. On that warm summer night, Perry says his wife packed some bags, walked out the door, and drove off. March says Janet never told him where she was going, and says when he asked her, she said, "None of your business. I'll see you in a couple days. See how it is with the kids." Since that night, no one has ever reported seeing Janet March again. Perry March says the evening started with a relatively normal family dinner. It was after he put their 2 children to bed, Perry says, that he and Janet began to argue. You know, it's the kind of argument that you have when you're both tired of the arguments. She had made a decision that she was going to take a vacation, he recalls. His wife was going away, Perry says, for 12 days, and was to come back just in time for their son Sammy's 6th birthday on August 27th. Change the light bulbs, balance my checkbook, clean the basement, you know? Just a various list of things that I had seemed to have dropped the ball on in the course of my 10 years with her, he remembers. And she made me sign her list, that I would have these things done when she got back. And she said, "See ya," and the door turned and she started her Volvo, and she drove off. No one else, not even Janet's parents, knew she was going away. Carolyn Levine says, Perry called at midnight on August 15th to tell them Janet had left. I said, Perry, don't worry about it. I'm sure if you had an argument she's upset, she's probably driving around to cool off. She'll be back. Call me when she comes home, Levine remembers. But Janet didn't come back in the morning, and Carolyn Levine says she began to worry about her daughter. Perry says he thought his wife might be luxuriating at a hotel, and that her disappearance was a stunt to make him understand what life as a young mother was like. Perry says he became worried after the 3rd or 4th day, because I knew what she had taken with her, and I knew it wasn't the amount of things that she needed for an extended period of time. When Janet didn't call home, her husband and her parents started looking for her. They called her friends. They went to the airport parking lot and looked for her car in the parking lot. They called hotels in Nashville and out of state. What they didn't do, oddly enough, is call the police. Perry says he didn't call police because he says the Levines forbade him to call the authorities. They were very concerned that if we reported something to the authorities, it would end up embarrassing Janet, and that would make my situation with her worse, he says. But the Levines say it was Perry who didn't want to call the police. Perry insisted he didn't want to go to the police. He wanted to see a private investigator, says Larry Levine. Perry calls that an outright lie. You can believe Janet's husband or not, but the fact is that the family waited a full 2 weeks before Perry and his father-in-law walked into a police station in Nashville and reported that Janet was missing. Why did it take 2 weeks? Well, that's my mistake. That's my mistake. Because I was living with these people, I loved these people, Perry says. And Larry Levine also says they made a mistake. But Perry kept telling us, maybe she went here. Maybe she went there. He told us a story. And unfortunately, I believed him, Carolyn Levine adds. At first, this was just another missing person case to Nashville detective Mickey Miller. The first thing we did is start checking credit card accounts and things of that nature, says Miller. But Janet had not left a paper trail. Already worried, Janet's friends knew something was very wrong when Janet wasn't there for Sammy's 6th birthday party. Then, just a week into their investigation, police found Janet's car parked in the lot of an apartment complex just a few miles from the March house. We found a lot of her personal items, including her passport, says Detective Miller. 3 weeks after Janet disappeared, with no credit card use, no phone calls home to check on the kids, and her car found with most of her belongings still packed inside, police decided this was no longer just a missing person case. It was a homicide. The Levine family and their friends posted a $25,000 reward for information, leading to the location of Mrs. March or her body, police announced. And the prime suspect in the case was Perry March. Perry refused police requests to interview him or his children. When he also refused to allow his house to be searched, police got a warrant. 1 month after the disappearance, police went inch by inch through the house. We vacuumed all the floors. We collected the vacuum bags out of the vacuums that belonged here. We even processed these hardwood floors for fingerprints and palm prints, recalls Nashville crime scene investigator Johnny Hunter. Investigators searched nearby woods, 2 lakes and a river, yet found no trace of Janet and no evidence that a crime had even been committed. They couldn't find some other reason to explain Janet's being missing. They couldn't find anything, and therefore it must be me, says Perry. But there was one thing about the search that really bothered police, and still does. Not what they found, but what they didn't find. Perry had told police that a list Janet had given him the night she left had been created on their home computer. That list was practically the only piece of evidence that backed up his story. But police didn't believe him. In fact, they wanted to get their hands on the computer's hard drive because they believed it might show that Perry, not Janet, had written the list. The problem was that the hard drive was missing. Perry says he did not remove the hard drive. Asked who he thinks removed it, Perry says, "Well, there's 2 people that are high on my list who could have removed it. One of them is Larry Levine, and the other is my father." Perry's father, Arthur March, had come to stay at Perry's house several days after Janet disappeared. But he says he doesn't even know what a hard drive is. And Larry Levine also said he did not remove the hard drive. "I had nothing to gain by trying to get at it," he says. Meanwhile, police became concerned about something else they didn't find: the tires on Perry's car. 6 days after Janet disappeared, Perry replaced the tires with new ones. It was on my list. The tires on the Jeep were bald, and she was worried the Jeep was going to be slipping in the rain and all this other kind of stuff, and I was just knocking off the stuff on my list, says Perry. But according to Detective Miller, the tire company says that the tires did not need to be changed. In fact, they questioned that, why the tires were being changed, and Perry said he just didn't like the type tires that were on the car at the time, and he wanted a different brand. Yet even as investigators became convinced that he was involved in his wife's disappearance, they couldn't come up with the evidence to charge Perry March with a crime. When their daughter first disappeared, the Levines struggled to make sense of their son-in-law's account that, after an argument, she packed her bags and left on a 12-day vacation. One thing that troubled Carolyn was the appointment her daughter had talked about the day she disappeared. "She asked me to go with her the next day to see a divorce lawyer," says Carolyn. When Perry was named as a suspect and stopped cooperating with police, the Levines' suspicions grew. Larry Levine says he is 100% certain Perry killed Janet. Unconditionally positive, he says. The Levines made their first move the day Perry was named as a suspect. They filed a court action to stop him from taking Sammy and Zeepy out of town. But that very day, Perry moved with his children to Chicago. The Levines then went to a Chicago court to file for visitation rights with their grandchildren. After a 2-year legal battle, a Chicago court granted the Levines weekend visitation rights. But when they showed up in a courtroom in the spring of 1999 to finalize the agreement, Perry wasn't there. He had moved to Mexico. "I moved to Mexico because I needed to get the hell out of Dodge and start a new life, and get out of their clutches," says Perry. Perry and his 2 children settled into a new life in a high-heck. the Mexican town his father Arthur had retired to years earlier. Arthur March helped his son get started on a new career as a financial and real estate advisor. Perry and his children moved into a house, along with Carmen Rojas, who he met during his first week in Mexico, and her 3 children. They married within a year. His old life in Nashville was a chapter Perry was now more than ready to close. As for what happened to his first wife, Janet, Carmen Rojas says she doesn't know what happened or why she went away. I've told the children the truth, that Mommy left home. We don't know what happened to her. It's very sad. But that's the truth, says Perry. The truth for the Levines was also very sad, but totally different. 2 months after Perry fled with their grandchildren to Mexico, Janet's parents filed a wrongful death claim against their former son-in-law in a Nashville civil court. When Perry failed to show up in court to fight the charge, Judge Frank Clement ruled against him and found him wrongfully responsible for causing her death. For the Levines, it was a vindication. But Perry says he thinks it's a crock. I think it's unconstitutional, he says. After a year in Mexico, there was no question for Sammy March, then age 9, and his sister Zippy, 6 at the time, that this was their home with their dad, Perry, and their new mom, Carmen. But 1,500 miles away, the Levines desperately wanted to see their grandchildren. Since the Levines' action against him for the wrongful death of their daughter, Perry had refused to let them have contact with the children. So in May 2000, the Levines showed up at their son-in-law's front door, armed with legal papers from the United States, granting them visitation and demanding to see their grandchildren. Perry refused to let the Levines visit Sammy and Zippy, and the grandparents went back to Nashville. But then, a month later, came a day Perry says he'll never forget. It was just after 9 a.m., and Sammy and Zippy were just starting their school day. Perry was in his office. 4 Mexicans walk in. One of them with a badge and a uniform says he's from immigration, and I'm to come with him immediately, he recalls. They grabbed me under the arms and put me in a headlock, lifted me by my ears, lifted me off my feet and shoved me through my conference room doors. And all I get is your paperwork is not in order. You're coming with us. I get down the stairs and there's an unmarked old white van in the parking lot. The door opens and they throw me in. These guys grab me in the car, hold me down, and the van takes off. At that very moment, a convoy of cars was approaching the entrance to Sammy and Zippy's school. Inside the cars were a local lawyer, a Mexican judge, several Mexican policemen, and the Levines. This time, the Levines got Mexican authorities to help them execute their court-ordered visitation, and Perry was in no position to try and stop them. What did he think was going on? I think my kids are being grabbed. Which is exactly what was occurring, says Perry. But word of what was happening at the school immediately got to Arthur March. This was the second time they came to kidnap my grandchildren, he says. Arthur March raced to the school and says he told Larry Levine to get out of there and leave my kids alone. Larry Levine claims Arthur March threatened him, allegedly telling him that neither he or his wife would get out of Mexico alive. Asked if he ever pulled a gun on the Levines or anyone working for them, Arthur March responds with shrugs and a smile. Back in the speeding van, Perry realized his armed captors were taking him to the airport. He decided to take a gamble. He dropped the name of the immigration official he suspected his captors were working for. The chief of the van got out and got on a cell phone. 3 minutes of conversation. He gets back into the van, turns around to me, and says, "It's a terrible mistake. I'm sorry. Your paperwork is in order," Perry recalls. When he was finally released, Perry sped off toward the school. "I was so angry I probably could have killed someone at that time," he says. He was too late. After a chaotic hour of arguments and threats, school administrators handed Sammy and Zippy over to the Mexican judge, who in turn handed them over to the Levines. When they brought the kids down and they saw us, they just came running. I just kind of knelt down and we hugged them, and they were happy to see us. And we were overjoyed to see them, remembers Carolyn Levine. By the time Perry reached the school, the Levines and his children were gone. But just behind the Levines, in hot pursuit, was Arthur March. Maybe I wasn't thinking rationally, but those are my grandkids, he says. We were very scared. We were very scared of this man, says Carolyn Levine. I believed that he would try and kill us. Absolutely, Larry Levine adds. Eventually, the Levines lost Arthur March and headed for an airport. Within 24 hours, Sammy and Zippy were back in Nashville. They are kidnappers. It was all a big orchestration, says Perry. But Larry Levine denies they are kidnappers. Absolutely not. How did the Levines choose that day to pick up their grandchildren? They had gotten a warning from the FBI that Mexican immigration officials planned to question, and maybe even deport Perry that morning. This would be a good time, they were told, to try once again to enforce their court order for visitation. This was a court order in which we were doing what the court said we had a right to do, says Larry Levine. While the court order said they had to return the children to their father in 39 days, the Levines were now taking steps to get permanent custody of Sammy and Zippy. They enrolled the children in a Nashville school. Back in Mexico, Perry was afraid he was going to lose his children for good. But then everything changed. Two heroes showed up in my life, lawyers by the name of Bob Katz and John Herbison, who had been following my case and volunteered to get my children back for me, says March. His American attorneys found a law that changed everything, not a Tennessee law, not even a United States law, but an international treaty. The bottom line is that this treaty says that you can't steal children and try to make custody determinations in the jurisdiction where you stole them to, says Perry. His lawyers took the case to a U.S. federal court and won. The Levines were told to send the children back with all due speed. Perry says his kids' return was a celebration. The first thing they did is they hugged me and said, "Daddy, why did it take so long to get us home?" By the summer of 2005, Perry and his new family had settled into life in Mexico. Sammy and Zippy were stars in their school, and Perry and Carmen opened a cafe. But 9 years after Janet's disappearance, police were about to make a stunning arrest. On the morning of August 3, 2003, Perry arrived at his restaurant around 8 a.m. His perfect world was about to collapse. Mexican immigration authorities grabbed Perry, saying his visa had been revoked. They were deporting him back to the United States immediately. Perry wasn't allowed to go pack a bag or kiss his wife and children goodbye, and was driven directly to the Guadalajara airport and put on a plane. The investigation into the murder of Janet March became the mission of Nashville's cold case detectives, Sergeant Pat Pastiglione and Bill Pridemore, in 2002. 2.5 years later, they took their evidence to a grand jury. The grand jury proceedings were conducted entirely in secret in December 2004, and 59 witnesses testified. In the end, and without his knowledge, Perry was indicted for the murder of his wife. After the indictment, the FBI and Nashville cops worked with Mexican immigration officials to get Perry out of Mexico and back on U.S. soil, where he could be arrested. Perry's plane landed in Los Angeles, the first time he had entered the United States since fleeing to Mexico years ago. Once in L.A., he was arrested for Janet's murder and handed over to detectives Pastiglione and Pridemore, who took him back to Nashville. For the Levines, the news of Perry's return to Nashville was bittersweet. Almost immediately, they started working to get the children back, going to court to seek custody. It took weeks and a number of court appearances, but eventually the Levines won custody. Perry, in the meantime, had gathered a team of lawyers and was fighting the criminal charges against him in preliminary hearings. In addition to second-degree murder, Perry had been indicted for tampering with evidence and, despite the fact that Janet's body had never been found, the macabre charge of abuse of a corpse Perry's lawyer pleaded not guilty on his behalf. Prosecutors are tight-lipped about any evidence they plan to present at the trial, but acknowledge much of the case is circumstantial, including the new tires Perry put on the family car after Janet disappeared, the missing hard drive from his home computer, and the discrepancies with Perry's original story of Janet's departure. Detective Miller, though no longer working the case, will be a key witness. Perry said that when Janet left, that she had written out a message, allegedly that she was going to go on an extended 12-day vacation, says Miller. The problem, says Miller, is that her son's birthday party was coming up. I think if you look at the date that she disappeared, on the 15th, and you add that 12 days to it, that would have her coming back on the 27th. And that would make sense because Sammy's birthday was on the 27th, he says. What somebody didn't think about was that Janet had already sent out invitations for his party for the 25th, 2 days before that. The grand jury also heard from a friend of Janet's, who spoke to her the very evening she disappeared. She had called to arrange a playdate with Sammy and her son for the next day. On the morning of August 16th, Sammy's friend and his mother showed up at the March house. The women rang the doorbell, knocked on the door, got no answer, and let themselves in. The woman walked down a hallway towards the kitchen, calling out to see if anyone was at home. When she got to a room, she says she heard Perry March's voice coming from behind that door. She says, he asked who it was. She told him, and he sent her on her way. But she did not leave before noticing something in the room that she later described as strange. There was a new oriental rug, fairly large rug. It was rolled up, basically blocking the doorway, where you go into Perry's study and Janet's art studio, says Detective Miller. Investigators have not found this rug, and Miller says Perry has denied its existence. The police theory is that after killing Janet, Perry put her body inside that rug and then buried it. That's a complete farce. I know the house I lived in, and I know there was no oriental rug in our house other than one runner this wide. If she had been wrapped in that rug, she would have looked like a hot dog wrapped, like one of those little sausages wrapped that you see on an appetizer tray, he said. The rug issue came up again in a recent bond hearing. Radina Friedman, who was Sammy March's court-appointed guardian during the early custody battles between Perry March and the Levines, said Sammy remembers the night his mother left. The night his mother disappeared, he heard his parents fighting. He did not see them. He heard them fighting. And then he fell asleep. When he woke up the following morning, his mother was gone. He saw a rug that was rolled up somewhere in the vicinity of the kitchen, and when he returned later that day, the rug was gone, says Friedman. And there is yet another bizarre and surprising twist in this case. Prosecutors now claim that Perry, while in jail, conspired with his father to kill Janet's parents, the people he blames for all of his troubles with the law. Prosecutors say after the job was done, Arthur would meet the killer at the Guadalajara airport, pay him off, and help him get away. Authorities say they got wind of the plan and they set up the meeting with Arthur March. It's BS, and they know it. The guy was never here. That's entrapment. They used the FBI to entrap me, says Arthur March. So in addition to the charge of murdering Janet, Perry, along with his father, faces charges of conspiracy to kill her parents. But Arthur March is taking a come-and-get-me stance. According to my lawyers here, what they do in the United States doesn't affect me here. I don't go peacefully. I don't go like Perry. There's going to be bloodshed somewhere, theirs or mine. Perry's lawyers say they will mount a vigorous defense. Their client has always proclaimed his innocence. Did you get in an argument with her that night? Did you get violent? Did you kill her, either accidentally or on purpose, and then dispose of the body? Lagatuta asked. The question is highly offensive to me. I know it's your job to ask it, and the answer is no, says March. Perry March's trial for Janet's murder is expected to start next summer. Sammy and ZP March are now living with the Levines in Nashville. If acquitted, March plans to fight to regain custody of his children. Arthur March remains a fugitive in Mexico. If you enjoyed the video, please show your support by subscribing and liking the video. And turn on all notifications so you don't miss any future uploads.